Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the heart of the wilderness with 8 harrowing tales of camping trips that turned into nightmarish encounters with the darkest corners of human nature and the unforgiving brutality of the wild. In this third episode of our camping horror series, we will uncover the terrifying experiences of 8 individuals who sought peace and solitude in nature, only to discover that sometimes the most isolated places harbor the most disturbing secrets. Each account has been meticulously verified through multiple sources and corroborated with official reports, police statements, and emergency service records. These are not campfire legends passed down through generations, but documented testimonies from survivors who lived through encounters that will forever change how they view the great outdoors. To safeguard the privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, certain names and specific locations have been modified, but the core truth of each terrifying encounter remains untouched. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily horror content that explores the documented darkness lurking in our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of verified nightmares. And let us know in the comments below which story disturbed you the most, or share your own camping horror experiences if you dare to relive them. Now let us begin with our first account, a story that proves that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wilderness walks on 2 legs. I have been camping solo for over 15 years now. Started when I was in college and needed to get away from the noise and stress of dorm life. Back then it was just weekend trips to state parks, nothing too adventurous. But over the years I developed a taste for more remote locations. The kind of places where you do not see another soul for days, where the only sounds are wind through trees and your own breathing. That isolation became my sanctuary. I thought I understood the risks. Weather, injury, getting lost, wildlife encounters. I prepared for all of those things meticulously. What I never prepared for was discovering that sometimes in the wilderness, you are not as alone as you think you are. Last October, I decided to try a trail I had never hiked before in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. It was called the Elk Ridge Trail, a moderately difficult route that promised stunning views and minimal foot traffic. The latter part appealed to me most. According to the ranger station, only about 20 people had signed the trail register in the past month. Perfect for what I was looking for. The weather forecast showed clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s at night, cold but manageable with proper gear. I started the hike around noon on a Friday, planning to camp overnight and return Saturday evening. The trailhead was empty except for my truck, which was exactly what I hoped to see. The first few miles were standard Pacific Northwest terrain, dense forest of Douglas fir and western hemlock, the ground carpeted with fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, that clean scent you only get deep in old-growth forest. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. About 4 miles in, I reached a small clearing where the trail split. The main path continued straight toward the ridge, but there was a smaller, less maintained trail branching off to the left. My map showed it as an old hunting route that eventually reconnected with the main trail about 6 miles further up. I decided to take it, thinking it might offer a different perspective on the landscape and definitely fewer people. The smaller trail was rougher, no doubt about it. Fallen logs blocked the path in several places, forcing me to climb over or detour around them. The undergrowth was thicker, branches catching on my pack and scratching at my legs. But there was something appealing about following a path that clearly saw very little use. I felt like an explorer pushing into untouched territory. Around 5 in the evening, I found what looked like a perfect campsite. A small meadow surrounded by towering trees with a creek running along one edge. The ground was level and relatively free of rocks, I could set up my tent with a clear view of the stars once darkness fell. I dropped my pack and started my routine. Tent first, then organize gear, gather firewood, filter water from the creek. Everything normal and methodical, the way I had done it hundreds of times before. As I was setting up my camp stove to prepare dinner, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away near the edge of the meadow, there was a plastic water bottle hanging from a tree branch. It looked like one of those disposable bottles you buy at gas stations, but it had been deliberately tied to the branch with what looked like paracord. I walked over to get a closer look, thinking maybe another hiker had left it as some kind of trail marker. When I reached the tree, I realized the bottle was one of mine. Same brand, same size, even the same slight dent near the cap that I remembered making when I dropped it earlier that day. But I still had all my water bottles in my pack. I checked to make sure, counting them twice, all accounted for. Yet here was an identical bottle hung deliberately from a tree branch like some kind of offering. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Same brand of water bottle, probably dropped by another hiker weeks ago and caught in the branches by wind. The dent was just wear and tear that happened to look similar to mine. But as I walked back to my campsite, something nagged at me. The paracord had looked fresh, not weathered like it had been hanging there for weeks or months. I tried to push the thought away as I prepared dinner. Freeze-dried beef stew, not exactly gourmet but filling and warm. The sun was setting, painting the meadow in long golden shadows. This was supposed to be my peaceful retreat, my chance to disconnect from the world and clear my head. I was not going to let some random piece of litter ruin the experience. But as darkness settled over the campsite, I found more bottles. 3 more to be exact, each one hanging from a different tree around the perimeter of the meadow. Each one identical to my water bottles. Same brand, same size, same dent. They formed a rough circle around my campsite, like markers defining a territory. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my headlamp and examined each bottle more closely. The paracord on all of them was definitely fresh, probably tied within the last few hours. The bottles themselves looked new too. No algae or dirt stains you would expect from something that had been outdoors for any length of time. Someone had placed these here recently. Someone who had access to the exact same water bottles I carried. I started thinking about the trail I had hiked that day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone else. There had been no other cars at the trailhead, no voices or footsteps behind me on the path. But that did not mean someone had not been following me at a distance, staying just out of sight among the trees. The thought made my skin crawl. I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed even though the night was still warm. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see the dim outlines of the hanging bottles swaying slightly in the breeze. They looked like grotesque Christmas ornaments, decorating my campsite. I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe another hiker had the same water bottles and had hung them for some legitimate reason. Trail markers, bear deterrents, who knows? But every explanation I came up with fell apart under scrutiny. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps circling my tent at what sounded like the same distance as the hanging bottles. The steps would pause for long moments, then resume, moving slowly clockwise around the meadow. I held my breath, listening as hard as I could, trying to determine if it was human or animal. The rhythm was too steady for most wildlife, too measured. But if it was a person, why were they circling my campsite in the middle of the night? I reached for the knife I always kept in my tent, a 4-inch fixed blade that had never been used for anything more threatening than cutting rope. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear the soft crush of pine needles, sometimes fading into the distance only to return minutes later. When dawn finally broke, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour before unzipping my tent and looking outside. The meadow looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful and empty, but the bottles were gone. All 4 of them had been removed, leaving only small marks in the bark where the paracord had rubbed against the branches. I broke camp as quickly as I had ever done anything in my life, stuffed my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it properly, just desperate to get moving. As I shouldered the pack and started toward the trail, I noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth near where my tent had been. They were not mine. The tread pattern was completely different, and they were at least 2 sizes larger than my boots. The footprints formed a complete circle around where my tent had been, maybe 10 feet out from the walls. Whoever had been walking around my campsite had done so multiple times, wearing a path in the forest floor. Near the edge of the meadow, the prints led off into the trees, heading in the same direction as the trail I needed to follow to get back to my truck. I had no choice but to follow the same path. It was the only way back to the trailhead, and my truck was my only way out of the mountains. But every step felt like I was walking deeper into a trap. The boot prints appeared regularly in patches of soft earth, always ahead of me, always following the exact route I needed to take. About 2 miles down the trail, I found more evidence of my stalker. Another water bottle, this one not hanging from a tree but placed carefully on a rock beside the path. It was opened, with about half the water gone. Next to it was a photograph, a Polaroid picture showing me at my campsite the night before, taken from the tree line while I was cooking dinner. I was clearly visible in the frame, unaware that someone was watching and documenting my every move. The photo shook me more than anything else had. This was not some random encounter with a disturbed individual. Someone had been planning this, following me with equipment and intention. They had water bottles identical to mine, a camera, and enough knowledge of the area to track me without being seen. This was predatory behavior, and I was the prey. I abandoned all pretense of normal hiking pace and started running. My pack bounced painfully against my back and branches tore at my clothes, but I did not care. I needed to reach my truck and get out of there before whoever was stalking me decided to escalate beyond psychological intimidation. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking and footsteps that were no longer trying to stay hidden. When I finally reached the trailhead, my truck was not alone. There was another vehicle parked nearby, a dark-colored pickup with tinted windows. The license plate was covered with mud, deliberately obscured. I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, but the tinted glass made it impossible to make out any details. As I approached my truck, the other vehicle started up and slowly drove away, but not before the driver rolled down their window just enough for me to see them watching me leave. I called the police from the first town I reached, about 40 minutes down the mountain highway. The officer who took my report was polite but clearly skeptical. No crime had actually been committed, he pointed out. Someone hiking in public forest land, even if they were following another hiker, was not technically illegal. The photographs were creepy but not necessarily criminal. He took down the information about the license plate but warned me that without clearer evidence of stalking or threats, there was little they could do. That was 3 months ago. I have not been camping alone since then. Every time I think about returning to the wilderness, I remember those water bottles hanging like warnings around my campsite and the sound of footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. The forest I once saw as a sanctuary now feels like a hunting ground where predators with human intelligence can track and toy with their prey. I still have the Polaroid photograph. Sometimes I take it out and study it, looking for clues about who took it and why. In the picture, I look completely relaxed and unaware, focused on my camp stove while someone watched me from the shadows. It serves as a reminder that in the wilderness, the most dangerous predator is not always the one with claws and fangs. Sometimes it walks on two legs and knows exactly how to exploit your need for solitude against you. Be careful when you seek isolation in the wild. Sometimes you find it and sometimes it finds you first. I never considered myself a particularly brave person. When my daughter Emma turned 14, I realized we had drifted apart during those difficult teenage years. She spent most of her time in her room, and our conversations had become limited to logistics about school and chores. That summer, I decided we needed to reconnect, and camping seemed like the perfect opportunity. Just the two of us, away from phones and distractions with time to actually talk. Emma was initially resistant to the idea. She complained about sleeping on the ground, bugs, and the lack of Wi-Fi. But eventually she agreed, probably more out of guilt than enthusiasm. I chose Pine Ridge State Park because it seemed perfect for a beginner camping trip. Well-maintained facilities, other families around for safety, and flush toilets, which Emma had insisted on as a non-negotiable requirement. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. The campground was busier than I expected, which was actually reassuring. Families with young children occupied most of the sites, and the atmosphere felt safe and welcoming. Our spot was in a loop with about 15 other campsites, close enough to other campers that we could hear the murmur of conversations and occasional laughter from nearby sites. Setting up our tent took longer than anticipated. Emma had zero interest in helping, instead sitting on a picnic table scrolling through her phone trying to find the one bar of cell service that occasionally appeared. I fumbled with tent poles and stakes, sweating in the afternoon heat and questioning my decision to attempt this mother-daughter bonding experience. By the time I got the tent properly secured, the sun was beginning to set. Dinner was dehydrated camping food heated on a small propane stove. Emma picked at her beef stroganoff with obvious disgust, but she did start talking. She told me about problems with friends at school, her anxiety about starting high school in the fall, and her frustration with her father, my ex-husband, who had been largely absent since our divorce 2 years earlier. For the first time in months, we were having a real conversation. As darkness settled over the campground, the temperature dropped into the comfortable 70s. Other campers had small fires going, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the trees. Children played flashlight tag between the sites while their parents cleaned up from dinner. The whole scene felt wholesomely American, like something from a camping brochure. Emma even seemed to be enjoying herself despite her earlier complaints. We zipped ourselves into the tent around 10:30, both exhausted from the day and the emotional conversations. Emma fell asleep quickly, curled up in her sleeping bag with her stuffed elephant, the same one she had slept with since she was 3. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the campground settling down for the night. Conversations grew quieter, fires were extinguished, and eventually the only sounds were insects, the distant hum of the highway and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I must have been asleep for several hours when something woke me. At first, I could not identify what had disturbed my sleep. The campground was quiet, much quieter than it had been when I fell asleep. No voices, no movement from neighboring sites, just an unusual stillness that felt wrong somehow. I checked my phone for the time, 3:17 in the morning. That was when I heard the zipper, slow, deliberate, and coming from the entrance to our tent. Someone was opening our tent from the outside, and they were being very careful about it. The sound was barely audible, just the faint whisper of metal teeth separating one by one. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized someone was trying to get into our tent without waking us. I reached over and gently shook Emma, pressing my finger to her lips when she started to stir. Her eyes went wide when she saw my expression, and she remained perfectly still. We both lay there, hardly breathing, listening to the zipper continue its slow progress. Whoever was outside was taking their time, probably assuming we were both sound asleep. Through the thin nylon of the tent wall, I could see the beam of a small flashlight moving around the entrance. The light was dim and focused, like someone trying to see inside without creating too much illumination. The zipper reached the bottom of the entrance, and I could see a gap beginning to form where someone could look inside or reach through. My mind raced through options. I had bear spray in my pack, but it was on the other side of the tent near the entrance where someone was trying to get in. My phone was next to my sleeping bag, but calling for help would alert whoever was outside that we were awake. Emma was pressed against my side, trembling but staying silent like I had taught her. The gap in the zipper widened, and I could see fingers reaching through, feeling around the interior of the tent. Adult fingers, thick and calloused, moving systematically as if searching for something specific. The person outside was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but with what sounded like excitement or anticipation. Then I heard voices, low whispers coming from outside the tent, and I realized with horror that there was more than one person. I could make out at least 2 different voices, maybe 3, having a quiet conversation just feet from where my daughter and I lay terrified. One voice, deeper than the others, said something about the young one. Another voice, higher pitched, laughed softly and mentioned something about taking her tonight. The words sent ice through my veins. These people were not random thieves or drunken campers. They were here specifically for Emma. The fingers continued exploring the interior of the tent, moving closer to where we lay. Emma squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers, but she remained completely silent. I could see the outline of a head now, someone pressing their face close to the gap in the zipper, trying to see inside our tent. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of remaining frozen with fear, I decided to act. I grabbed my flashlight, the brightest one I had brought, and suddenly turned it on at full power while shouting as loudly as I could. "Help! Help! Someone is trying to get in our tent!" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The figures outside our tent scrambled backward, and I could hear multiple sets of footsteps running away through the campground. I kept shouting, "Help us! Call the police!" while pushing Emma toward the back of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible. Lights began coming on in other tents and RVs around the campground. I heard car doors slamming and voices calling out, asking what was wrong. Within minutes, several other campers had gathered around our tent, and someone had called 911 on their cell phone. When I finally felt safe enough to emerge from the tent, I found that the entrance zipper had been opened about 2 feet, enough for someone to reach inside or for a small person to crawl through. The area around our tent showed clear evidence of multiple people. Footprints in the dirt, broken twigs, and trampled grass where several individuals had been standing or crouching near our tent. The park rangers arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by local police. They took our statement and examined the area around our tent with flashlights, photographing the evidence and taking notes. What they told us made the experience even more frightening than it had been in the moment. 2 other families in the campground reported similar incidents that same night. In one case, a family with a 10-year-old daughter had found their tent partially unzipped in the morning, though they had not awakened during the incident. Another family reported seeing figures moving between tents around 3 in the morning, but had assumed it was campers returning from the bathroom. The police officer explained that this was not the first time they had received reports of this nature from Pine Ridge State Park. Over the past 6 months, there had been several incidents involving groups of individuals targeting campsites with young children, particularly families with teenage daughters. In most cases, the intruders fled when confronted, but there had been one incident 3 months earlier where a 14-year-old girl had gone missing from a campsite. She was found the next day, unharmed but traumatized, several miles away in the woods. The officer strongly recommended that we pack up and leave immediately, rather than staying for the remainder of our planned trip. He explained that the individuals involved in these incidents often returned to the same areas, and there was no guarantee they would not try again the following night. We packed our gear in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by concerned fellow campers who helped us break down our tent and load our car. Emma was quiet during the whole process, but she stayed close to me and kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the trees. During the drive home, Emma finally spoke about what had happened. She told me she had been awake before I shook her, that she had heard footsteps circling our tent for what felt like hours before anyone tried to open the zipper. She had remained perfectly still, pretending to be asleep because she was terrified that any movement would let them know she was aware of their presence. The experience changed both of us in ways that took months to fully understand. Emma developed severe anxiety about sleeping away from home and had nightmares for weeks afterward. I found myself constantly checking locks and looking over my shoulder, especially in parking lots or other isolated areas. We never did try camping again. The bonding experience I had hoped for did happen, but not in the way I had planned. Going through something that terrifying together created a closeness between Emma and me that had been missing for years. She stopped taking her safety for granted, and I stopped assuming that family-friendly locations were automatically safe. 6 months later, we learned that police had arrested 3 men in connection with the incidents at Pine Ridge State Park. They had been targeting families with teenage daughters, using the cover of the campground environment to select potential victims. The men had been watching families during the day, identifying tents with young girls and returning late at night to attempt abductions. The police officer who called to update us said that our decision to make noise and alert other campers had likely prevented a much more serious crime. The men had been prepared to take Emma that night, and they had tools and restraints in their vehicle that suggested they had done this before. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear the sound of a zipper being slowly opened. Emma is in college now, strong and confident, but she has never forgotten that night. We both learned that predators exist in places where you least expect them, and that sometimes the thing that saves you is not being quiet and hoping they go away, but making as much noise as possible and demanding help. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Make noise. Wake up the neighbors. Better to be embarrassed about a false alarm than to become a victim because you were too polite to cause a scene. I started wilderness survival camping as a way to challenge myself and disconnect from the digital world that had consumed my life as a software developer. What began as weekend trips to state parks gradually evolved into more ambitious solo expeditions into remote wilderness areas. I prided myself on my preparation and self-sufficiency. I studied edible plants, learned to purify water from natural sources, and practiced building shelters from materials found in the forest. The trip that changed everything was planned as my most ambitious yet. 2 weeks completely off-grid in the canyon country of southern Utah, living entirely off the supplies I carried and whatever food I could forage from the land. I had done extensive research on the area, studying topographic maps and identifying water sources and potential camping spots. The plan was to hike deep into a remote canyon system, far from any established trails or camping areas. I started the journey in late September, when the desert heat had begun to subside, but temperatures were still warm enough for comfortable camping. My pack contained carefully calculated rations for the first week, along with fishing gear, snares for small game, and a comprehensive field guide to edible desert plants. The second week would test my ability to live entirely off the land, something I had never attempted for more than 3 days. The first few days went exactly as planned. I hiked deep into the canyon, following a seasonal stream bed that provided both water and a natural route through the rugged terrain. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering red rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side of the narrow canyon floor. I felt like an explorer discovering uncharted territory, even though I knew satellite imagery had mapped every inch of the area. I established my base camp next to a reliable water source, a series of pools fed by a small spring that emerged from the canyon wall. The location was perfect, sheltered from wind and with enough flat ground for my tent and cooking area. During the day, I explored side canyons and practiced the survival skills I had studied for months. I found edible cactus pads, gathered pine nuts, and even managed to catch 2 small trout from the deeper pools. By the end of the first week, I was feeling confident and accomplished. I had consumed most of my carried food as planned, and my attempts at foraging and fishing had been successful enough to supplement my diet. My body had adjusted to the physical demands of living outdoors, and I felt stronger and more alert than I had in years. That confidence began to erode on day 8. I woke up feeling nauseous and weak, symptoms I initially attributed to the physical demands of the trip and the change in diet. But as the day progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps. By evening, I was unable to keep food down, vomiting up everything I tried to eat, including water. At first, I assumed I had eaten something that disagreed with me. Desert survival guides warn about the dangers of consuming unfamiliar plants, and I thought perhaps I had misidentified something I had foraged the previous day. I decided to stick to bland foods and focus on staying hydrated, expecting the symptoms to pass within a day or 2. They did not pass. By day 10, I had not kept solid food down in over 48 hours. The stomach cramps had intensified to the point where I could barely stand upright. Even small sips of water triggered violent retching that left me weak and dizzy. I began to realize that I was facing a serious medical emergency in one of the most isolated places I had ever been. The nearest road was at least 20 miles away through rugged canyon terrain, and I had not seen another human being since starting the trip. My cell phone had no signal, and my GPS device, while still functional, only served to confirm how far I was from any possibility of help. I was completely on my own, and my body was shutting down. On day 11, desperation began to cloud my judgment. The hunger had become a living thing inside me, gnawing at my insides with relentless intensity. I had not eaten anything substantial in 4 days, and my body was beginning to consume itself. I could feel my muscles weakening, and simple tasks like gathering firewood left me exhausted and breathless. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that still haunts me. While exploring a side canyon in search of anything edible, I found what appeared to be strips of dried meat hanging from the branches of a dead juniper tree. The meat looked professionally prepared, cut into uniform strips and dried to the consistency of jerky. In my weakened state, finding this unexpected source of protein felt like a miracle. I should have been suspicious. I should have questioned how prepared meat could appear in such a remote location, far from any established camping areas or hunting grounds. But hunger had compromised my ability to think clearly. The strips of meat looked clean and properly preserved, and the smell was not unpleasant. My body craved protein so desperately that rational thought became impossible. I ate 3 strips of the dried meat, and within minutes, I felt better than I had in days. The nausea subsided, the stomach cramps eased, and I felt a surge of energy that allowed me to think clearly for the first time since the illness began. I gathered more of the meat, stuffing it into my pack like a starving person hoarding food. It was only later, as I was examining the remaining strips more carefully, that I noticed details that should have alarmed me from the beginning. The cuts were too uniform, too professional. This was not meat that had been prepared by a casual hunter or camper. The preservation was too perfect, and the quantity was too large for someone to have simply lost or abandoned it. More disturbing was the Location itself. The dead juniper tree was positioned in a small clearing that would be visible from several different approaches. The meat had been hung at exactly the right height to be easily spotted by someone walking through the area. This was not a random discovery, it was bait. That realization led to others. My illness had begun shortly after I started drinking from a specific pool that I had been using as my primary water source. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Something had contaminated that water source, and something else had provided a convenient solution in the form of the dried meat. I was being manipulated, and I had fallen for it completely. The thought that something was deliberately poisoning water sources and then offering tainted food to desperate victims sent ice through my veins. I was not alone in this canyon. Something with intelligence and planning ability was here, and it was hunting using methods that targeted the most basic human needs. I abandoned my campsite immediately despite the onset of darkness. Moving through the canyon at night was dangerous, but staying in a location where I had been deliberately targeted felt more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rocky terrain, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The journey out of the canyon took 2 days of difficult hiking while still recovering from the effects of the contaminated water and whatever had been in the dried meat. Several times I found more evidence of the same deliberate baiting. Strips of meat hung from trees positioned where a desperate hiker would easily spot them. Fresh water sources that looked clean but had an odd chemical smell that I now recognized as a warning sign. By the time I reached my truck, I was in critical condition. I drove directly to the nearest hospital where I spent the next 5 days undergoing treatment for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what doctors initially assumed was food poisoning. Blood tests revealed the presence of several toxic compounds that the medical staff could not immediately identify. The most disturbing discovery came when I provided park rangers with detailed information about the location where I had found the dried meat. A search team investigated the area and found evidence of a much larger operation. Hidden caches of prepared meat, systematic contamination of water sources, and signs that multiple people had been through the area recently despite its remoteness. The rangers explained that there had been 3 unexplained disappearances in the general area over the past 2 years. All involved experienced hikers or campers who had planned extended solo trips into remote wilderness areas. In each case, the missing person had told friends or family about their plans to test their survival skills by living off the land for extended periods. Law enforcement eventually classified the incidents as connected to a group that was deliberately targeting people who fit a specific profile. Solo campers with survival experience who planned to stay in remote areas for extended periods were being systematically poisoned and then offered contaminated food when they became desperate enough to accept it. The investigation revealed that the group responsible had been using these methods to isolate and capture people, for reasons that I was never fully briefed on. What I learned was enough to ensure that I never attempted solo wilderness survival again. The rangers strongly advised against discussing the details publicly, as the investigation was ongoing and the perpetrators had not been apprehended. I recovered physically from the experience, though it took months to regain the weight I had lost and to trust my body's responses to food and water again. The psychological impact was more lasting. The wilderness I had seen as a place of challenge and personal growth became a hunting ground where predators used human desperation as a weapon. I still camp occasionally, but never alone and never in remote areas where help is more than a few hours away. I carry emergency communication devices and enough food to last twice as long as any planned trip. Most importantly, I never consume anything I find in the wild, no matter how desperate the situation might become. The dried meat hanging from that dead juniper tree saved my life in the short term, but it was intended to do something much worse in the long term. Sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected sources, but sometimes that help comes with a price that makes death seem preferable. Trust your instincts when something seems too convenient, especially when you are at your most vulnerable. The wilderness will test you in ways you cannot anticipate, and sometimes the greatest danger comes not from nature, but from those who understand how to use your survival instincts against you. Every year for 8 years, the same group of friends gathered for our annual camping trip. We called ourselves the September Squad because we always scheduled the trip for the weekend after Labor Day, when the summer crowds had thinned out but the weather was still warm enough for comfortable sleeping under the stars. There were 6 of us originally, though the group had fluctuated over the years as people moved away or life got in the way. This particular year, only 4 of us could make it. Me, Sarah, Tom, and Jake. We had chosen Sequoia National Forest for our destination, partly because none of us had been there before and partly because Tom had found what he claimed was the perfect campsite through some backpacking forum. Remote enough to avoid crowds, but accessible enough that we would not need to hike more than 3 miles with full packs. We should have paid more attention to the fire restrictions that were posted at every entrance to the forest. The signs were everywhere, warning about extreme fire danger due to drought conditions and unusually high temperatures for September. But we had been car camping for years, and we assumed the warnings were the usual bureaucratic overcaution. We planned to have a campfire just like we always did. It was tradition. The first sign that something was wrong came Friday evening as we were setting up camp. The ranger who checked our permits mentioned that there were several small fires burning in areas north of where we planned to camp. Nothing to worry about, he said, but he recommended that we keep our radio tuned to the emergency frequency and be prepared to leave quickly if conditions changed. We thanked him and made jokes about ranger paranoia as soon as he drove away. That night, the sunset was spectacular. The entire western sky burned red and orange, with colors more intense than any of us had ever seen. Tom took dozens of photos trying to capture the dramatic light painting the mountains and forests. Sarah mentioned that the air smelled like smoke, but we attributed it to distant campfires from other camping areas. We built our own fire as planned, roasting hot dogs and making s'mores like we had done every year since college. The familiar ritual was comforting, and we fell into the easy conversation and shared memories that made these trips special. None of us wanted to think about the fact that this might be our last September Squad camping trip. Sarah was getting married in the spring and moving to Portland. Tom had been talking about taking a job overseas. Nothing stays the same forever. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, but the smell of smoke was stronger. When I looked to the north, I could see a haze hanging over the ridgeline that had not been there the night before. Jake suggested we hike up to a higher viewpoint to get a better sense of what was happening. But the rest of us voted to stay at camp and enjoy our traditional lazy morning of coffee and pancakes, cooked over the camp stove. By noon, the wind had picked up significantly. What started as a gentle breeze became steady gusts that rattled the trees and sent dust swirling around our campsite. The air temperature seemed to be rising every hour, and the humidity dropped to the point where our lips were cracking and our throats felt constantly dry. The radio crackled to life around 2 in the afternoon with an evacuation advisory for areas north of our location. The announcement was calm and professional, recommending that campers in specified zones consider leaving as a precautionary measure. Our campsite was not in the designated evacuation zone, but it was close enough that we could see the areas being evacuated from our location. We debated whether to pack up and leave. Tom and Jake wanted to stay, arguing that we were outside the evacuation zone and that leaving would waste the weekend we had all planned for months. Sarah and I were more concerned, especially after the wind shifted and began blowing directly from the north, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of burning forest. The decision was made for us around 4 o'clock when the evacuation advisory became a mandatory evacuation order, and the zone was expanded to include our campsite. A ranger drove through the area with a loudspeaker ordering all campers to break camp immediately and proceed to the main highway via the access road. We started packing quickly, but 8 years of accumulated camping gear takes time to organize and load properly. We had 2 cars between the 4 of us, and we had to decide what was essential and what could be left behind if necessary. The process took longer than it should have because we kept stopping to watch the sky, which was growing darker and more ominous by the hour. By 5:30, we were finally packed and ready to leave. That was when we discovered that the access road we had used to reach the campsite was blocked. A tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road, probably blown down by the increasingly strong winds. The tree was too large for us to move, and there was no room for the cars to drive around it. Tom and Jake tried to clear the road using a small chainsaw that Tom kept in his truck for camping trips. They managed to cut through some of the smaller branches, but the main trunk was too thick for the small saw, and the chain broke after 20 minutes of hard work. We were trapped. The wind continued to strengthen and the sky continued to darken. What had started as a hazy sunset effect now looked like an approaching thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. Just smoke, thick and black and moving toward us with frightening speed. Sarah found an old logging road on her map that showed a route out of the area, but it meant driving deeper into the forest before turning back toward the highway. None of us liked the idea of driving away from safety, but it was the only option we could identify. We decided to try the logging road and hope it was still passable. The logging road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle. We drove in convoy with Tom's truck leading because it had higher clearance, followed by my SUV with Sarah and Jake as passengers. The road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching what should have been the junction with another road that would take us back toward the highway. The junction was not there. Either our map was wrong, or the road had been closed and the junction removed. We found ourselves at the end of a dead-end road with no way to turn around easily and no clear route to safety. Behind us, the sky was now completely black, and the wind was carrying burning embers that landed on the dry grass and immediately caught fire. That was when we realized we were in a situation that could kill us. The fire was moving faster than we had imagined possible, and we were trapped in an area with limited options for escape. The logging road was too narrow to turn around quickly, and backing out would take longer than we had. Tom made the decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of trying to retreat back down the logging road, he drove his truck straight into the small creek that ran alongside the dead end. The water was only about 2 feet deep, but it was flowing and surrounded by rocks and gravel that would not burn easily. We followed his lead, driving my SUV into the creek bed and positioning both vehicles as close to the water as possible. We soaked towels and sleeping bags in the creek water and covered the cars, then huddled in the creek itself, using the vehicles as shields against the radiant heat that was beginning to build. The fire reached us around 7 o'clock. I have never experienced anything like the sound of an approaching wildfire. It sounds like a freight train combined with a waterfall, a constant roar that drowns out everything else. The heat was incredible, like opening an oven door but multiplied by 1,000. Even with wet towels covering us and creek water surrounding us, the air became so hot that each breath felt like it was burning my lungs. We stayed in the creek for 6 hours while the fire burned around us. Trees exploded like bombs when the fire reached them. The sound was terrifying, sharp cracks followed by crashes as burning timber fell across the creek and the road. Several times, burning branches fell close enough to us that we had to dive underwater to avoid being hit. The cars were badly damaged but provided crucial protection from the radiant heat. The paint bubbled and peeled, the tires melted, and all the plastic components warped or melted completely. But the metal shells held together and gave us something to shelter behind when the heat became unbearable. Around 1 in the morning, the fire began to move past our location. The roaring sound gradually diminished, and the air temperature started to drop. We emerged from the creek to find ourselves in a completely changed landscape. Everything around us had burned. The trees were black skeletons, the ground was covered with ash, and the air was still thick with smoke. We spent the rest of the night in the creek bed, too exhausted and traumatized to attempt any movement in the darkness. At dawn, we started walking out along the burned remains of the logging road, leaving the damaged cars behind. We walked for 8 miles through the blackened forest before reaching the main highway, where we were picked up by emergency personnel. Both Sarah and Jake suffered second-degree burns on their arms and backs. Tom lost the hearing in his left ear permanently due to the noise and pressure from the fire. I developed respiratory problems that lasted for months and still affect me during allergy season. We learned later that the fire had consumed over 50,000 acres and destroyed hundreds of structures. 14 people died, including 3 other campers who had been caught in areas without access to water. Our decision to stay in the creek probably made the difference between life and death. The September squad never camped together again after that weekend. The experience changed all of us in ways that made it impossible to recapture the carefree attitude that had made our annual trips special. We stayed friends, but the shared trauma of that night created a bond that was different from anything we had experienced before. I still camp occasionally, but never during fire season, and never without multiple escape routes planned in advance. I carry emergency radios, satellite communicators, and more water than any reasonable person would need for a weekend trip. Most importantly, I never ignore evacuation warnings or fire restrictions, no matter how inconvenient they might be. Nature does not negotiate, and it does not make exceptions for traditions or convenience. When the forest decides to burn, everything in its path becomes fuel, and your only chance of survival is to respect its power and get out of the way before it arrives. My 3 closest friends from college and I had been planning our graduation camping trip for months. After 4 years of studying, exams, and stress, we wanted to celebrate our degrees with something memorable and adventurous. We chose a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia that promised challenging hiking, scenic views, and the kind of wilderness experience that would give us stories to tell for years to come. The group consisted of me, my roommate Marcus, and our friends Kevin and Tyler. We were all reasonably experienced hikers, having done numerous day trips and weekend camping excursions throughout our college years. This trip was planned as a 4-day backpacking adventure, hiking deeper into the mountains than any of us had gone before, far from the popular sections of the trail that attract crowds of casual hikers. We started our hike on a Thursday morning in late May when the weather was warm but not yet oppressively hot, and the spring foliage was at its most beautiful. The trail was well marked and maintained, winding through dense forest of oak, maple, and pine. We made good time during the first day, covering about 8 miles before setting up camp at a designated backcountry site near a small stream. The first night was everything we had hoped for. We cooked dinner over our camp stoves, shared stories about our college experiences and plans for the future, and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest around us. Marcus was starting a job with an engineering firm in North Carolina. Tyler had been accepted to graduate school in Colorado, and Kevin was planning to travel through Europe before settling down to a career. This felt like the end of one chapter of our lives and the beginning of something new. The second day took us deeper into the mountains along a less traveled section of trail that required more navigation skills and physical endurance. The path was narrower and less well-maintained, with fallen trees blocking the route in several places and stream crossings that required careful attention to avoid slipping on wet rocks. But the sense of accomplishment when we reached our planned campsite for the second night made the extra effort worthwhile. It was during the second night that we first encountered the group that would turn our celebration into a nightmare. We had finished dinner and were sitting around our small camp stove playing cards and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere when we heard voices approaching through the forest. At first, we were pleased to encounter other hikers, thinking it would be nice to meet fellow outdoor enthusiasts and perhaps share stories about our experiences on the trail. 3 men emerged from the darkness beyond our campfire light, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, carrying backpacks and hiking gear that looked well used and professional. They seemed friendly enough initially, introducing themselves as experienced backpackers who had been hiking this section of trail for several days. They asked about our route and destination, and we shared our plans openly, thinking we were just engaging in the kind of casual conversation that happens between hikers who encounter each other in the wilderness. But something about their demeanor made me uncomfortable. They asked too many specific questions about where we had started, how long we planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew exactly where we were. When Tyler mentioned that we had told our families and friends our general itinerary but not our specific campsite locations, I noticed the 3 men exchange glances that made my stomach tighten with unease. They lingered at our campsite longer than seemed normal for casual trail encounters. Most hikers who meet in the backcountry might chat for 15 or 20 minutes before moving on to their own campsites, but these men stayed for over an hour, asking increasingly personal questions about our backgrounds, our families, and our financial situations. When Kevin mentioned that his parents were wealthy and had funded his college education, their interest became even more intense. Around 10 o'clock, they finally said goodnight and disappeared back into the forest, claiming they were going to set up their own camp about a mile further up the trail. We watched them leave with relief, but none of us felt comfortable enough to discuss what had made the encounter so unsettling. Instead, we cleaned up our campsite, secured our food in bare canisters, and went to sleep earlier than we had planned. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling our campsite. At first, I thought it might be animals investigating our area, but the rhythm and pattern of the steps were clearly human. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening as multiple sets of feet moved quietly through the forest around our tents, stopping periodically as if the people were observing us or discussing something in whispers too quiet for me to understand. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear breathing and the rustle of clothing, sometimes fading into the distance before returning. I wanted to wake my friends, but I was afraid that any movement or noise might trigger whatever these people were planning. Instead, I remained motionless, trying to control my breathing and hoping that whatever was happening would resolve peacefully. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard voices that were louder and clearer than the previous whispers. The 3 men from earlier were back, and they were no longer trying to hide their presence. One of them was saying something about the rich one and easy money, while another voice discussed the best way to handle 4 of them without noise. That was when I realized we were being targeted for robbery and possibly worse. These were not casual hikers who had happened upon our campsite by chance. They had been scouting us during their earlier visit, gathering information about our financial backgrounds and assessing our vulnerability. Now they were planning an attack that would take place while we were asleep and helpless in our tents. I reached over and quietly shook Marcus awake, whispering that we were in danger and needed to wake the others without alerting the men outside. Marcus immediately understood the gravity of the situation and began carefully rousing Kevin and Tyler while I listened to the ongoing conversation outside our tents. The men were discussing which one of us they thought would be most likely to resist, and they were debating whether to use weapons to intimidate us or to rely on surprise and superior numbers. One of them mentioned having a knife, while another talked about a piece, which I assumed meant a gun. The casual way they discussed violence made it clear that this was not their first time targeting hikers in remote areas. We had to make a decision quickly. Our tents were positioned in a small clearing with limited escape routes, and the men seemed to know the area better than we did. Running blindly into the forest in darkness would be dangerous, but staying and hoping they would leave seemed even more dangerous given what we had overheard. Marcus made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed during our setup the night before that there was a steep slope leading down to a creek about 50 yards from our campsite. The slope was covered with thick undergrowth that would provide concealment, and the creek might offer a route away from the area that would be difficult for our pursuers to follow in darkness. We gathered only our most essential items, leaving our tents and most of our gear behind to avoid making noise with zippers and buckles. Moving as quietly as possible, we crawled out of our tents and began making our way toward the slope, staying low and using the trees for cover. We almost made it undetected. We were within 20 yards of the slope when Kevin stepped on a branch that snapped loudly in the quiet forest. Immediately, the conversation outside our camp stopped, followed by the sound of running footsteps and angry voices as the men realized their intended victims were escaping. What followed was a terrifying chase through dense forest in near total darkness. We crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over fallen logs, and slid down steep slopes while being pursued by 3 men who seemed to know the terrain much better than we did. Behind us, we could hear them shouting instructions to each other and coordinating their pursuit in a way that suggested they had done this before. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. We managed to reach the creek and followed it downstream, hoping that the sound of running water would mask our movements and that the rocky creek bed would make it harder for them to track us. Several times we had to stop and hide while our pursuers passed nearby, sometimes close enough that we could hear their breathing and cursing. Eventually, we reached a section of the creek where it joined a larger stream, and we followed that downstream until we found an old logging road that led back toward the main trail system. By dawn, we had put enough distance between ourselves and our attackers that we felt relatively safe, though we continued hiking as quickly as possible toward the nearest trailhead. We reached my car around noon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Tyler had suffered some cuts and bruises from crashing through the underbrush, and all of us were dehydrated and emotionally drained. But we were alive and free. We drove directly to the nearest police station and reported the incident, providing detailed descriptions of the 3 men and the location where the encounter had taken place. The police took our report seriously and sent officers to investigate the area, but they found our abandoned campsite empty except for our gear, which had been ransacked and most of our valuable items stolen. There was no sign of the 3 men, and despite a search of the surrounding area, they were never located or identified. We learned later that there had been several similar incidents reported in remote areas of the Appalachian Trail over the previous 2 years. Groups of experienced hikers targeting college students and other young campers who appeared to have money and were hiking in isolated areas. In most cases, the victims had been robbed and threatened, but not seriously injured. In one case, however, a solo hiker had been found dead under circumstances that suggested murder during a robbery attempt. Our graduation camping trip became a story of survival rather than celebration, and the experience changed all of our attitudes about wilderness camping and personal safety. We remained friends, but we never attempted another backcountry camping trip together. The trust and sense of security that made such adventures enjoyable had been permanently damaged by our encounter with predators who used the wilderness as their hunting ground. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about people you encounter in remote areas. The wilderness attracts people seeking solitude and adventure, but it also provides cover for those with darker intentions who understand that help is far away and witnesses are few. I had been dreaming about a solo winter camping trip for years. As someone who prided herself on being prepared and self-sufficient, I wanted to prove that I could handle the most challenging conditions nature could throw at me. I spent months researching cold weather gear, studying winter survival techniques, and planning every detail of what I hoped would become an annual tradition of testing my limits against the elements. The location I chose was the White Mountain region of New Hampshire, specifically an area known for its challenging winter conditions, but also for its beauty when covered in snow. I selected a campsite near a frozen lake, about 4 miles from the nearest parking area, via a well-marked but unplowed winter trail. The forecast showed temperatures dropping to around 10 degrees below zero, with light snow expected but nothing that seemed dangerous for someone with proper equipment and experience. My gear was the result of months of research and a significant financial investment. A 4-season mountaineering tent rated for extreme cold, a sleeping bag designed for temperatures down to -20 degrees, and a comprehensive collection of winter camping equipment that filled 2 large backpacks. I had tested everything during day trips and overnight excursions closer to home, and I felt confident that I was prepared for anything the mountains could deliver. The hike to my chosen campsite took longer than expected due to the depth of the snow and the weight of my gear, but the effort was worth it when I emerged from the forest into the clearing beside the frozen lake. The landscape was pristine and beautiful, with snow-covered peaks rising on all sides and a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. This was exactly the kind of solitude and natural beauty I had been seeking. Setting up camp in winter conditions requires careful attention to detail that summer camping does not demand. I used snowshoes to pack down a platform for my tent, ensuring that the base was level and firm enough to support the structure without creating pressure points that could damage the floor. The tent itself was designed to handle heavy snow loads, with a geodesic dome structure that distributed weight evenly across multiple support poles. The first night went perfectly. Despite temperatures that dropped to 15 below zero, my sleeping system kept me comfortable, and I woke up refreshed and excited to spend a full day photographing the winter landscape. I cooked breakfast on my winter-rated stove, melted snow for water, and felt a deep satisfaction at successfully executing all the skills I had spent so long learning and practicing. The weather began to change on the second day. What started as light snow flurries gradually intensified throughout the afternoon, and the temperature began dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. By evening, the snow was falling heavily and the wind had picked up enough to create significant drifting around my campsite. I checked the weather radio and discovered that the storm system was larger and more intense than meteorologists had initially predicted. The radio forecast called for freezing rain followed by heavy snow, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero. This was beyond what I had prepared for, and I began to consider the possibility of packing up and hiking out immediately, despite the approaching darkness and deteriorating conditions. That decision was made for me around midnight when I was awakened by a sharp cracking sound followed by the sensation of my tent collapsing around me. The weight of accumulated snow and ice had exceeded the structural capacity of even my high-end mountaineering tent, and one of the main support poles had snapped under the load. Within minutes, my shelter went from a warm, protective cocoon to a twisted mass of fabric and broken aluminum that provided no protection from the storm. The temperature inside the collapsed tent dropped immediately as wind and snow found their way through gaps in the fabric. My sleeping bag, which had been perfectly adequate when used inside a proper shelter, became insufficient when exposed to the full force of the storm. I could feel my core body temperature beginning to drop as I struggled to extract myself from the tangle of tent fabric and broken poles. Getting out of the collapsed tent in the middle of a winter storm was like emerging into a frozen hell. The wind was strong enough to knock me off balance, and the combination of snow and freezing rain created visibility of only a few feet in any direction. My headlamp beam was immediately swallowed by the swirling precipitation, and I realized that I was facing a survival situation that could easily become fatal within hours. My first priority was finding or creating some kind of shelter that could protect me from the wind and precipitation. The collapsed tent was useless, and the nearest tree line was at least 100 yards away through knee-deep snow. I remembered reading about snow caves as emergency shelters, but digging one would require more time and energy than I might have available given how quickly my body temperature was dropping. Instead, I decided to try to create a snow wall that could provide at least partial protection from the wind. Using my snowshoes as makeshift shovels, I began piling snow into a barrier on the windward side of where my tent had been. The work was exhausting in the extreme cold, and I had to stop frequently to warm my hands and prevent frostbite in my fingers. As I worked, I began to recognize the early symptoms of hypothermia setting in. My thinking became sluggish, my movements grew clumsy, and I started making decisions that I knew were irrational even as I made them. The most dangerous was when I began to feel warm despite being in a life-threatening situation. And I actually considered removing some of my outer clothing layers because they seemed unnecessarily bulky. That false sense of warmth is one of the final stages of hypothermia, and recognizing it probably saved my life. I forced myself to put on additional layers instead of removing them, and I increased my physical activity level to generate more body heat, even though the exertion was exhausting my already limited energy reserves. The snow wall I had constructed provided some relief from the wind, but it was not enough to create a truly warm shelter. My sleeping bag was becoming saturated with snow and losing its insulating properties, and my core body temperature continued to drop despite my efforts to stay warm. I realized that I needed to make a difficult decision about whether to stay and try to wait out the storm or attempt to hike out in dangerous conditions. The decision was made for me when my water bottles froze solid despite being stored inside my jacket close to my body heat. This indicated that the temperature had dropped below the threshold where my current gear and shelter could keep me alive indefinitely. I had to move or risk dying in place as my body gradually shut down from the cold. Hiking out in whiteout conditions with no visibility was extremely dangerous, but staying was becoming more dangerous by the hour. I packed only the most essential items, abandoning most of my gear to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The trail back to my truck was marked, but the markers would be difficult to find in the storm, and missing the trail could mean wandering in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia became fatal. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through deep snow while being battered by wind and freezing rain that cut through even my best cold weather gear. Several times I lost the trail completely and had to backtrack to find the markers, wasting precious energy and time, while my core body temperature continued to drop. My hands and feet became completely numb, and I began to lose the fine motor control needed to operate zippers, buckles, and other essential gear. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I fell through what I thought was solid snow into a hidden creek that had not completely frozen. The ice water soaked through my boots and lower legs, creating an immediate emergency that could lead to severe frostbite within minutes. I managed to get out of the creek, but now I was dealing with wet feet and sub-zero temperatures, which significantly increased the risk of losing toes or worse. I reached my truck just as dawn was breaking, after 6 hours of the most difficult hiking I had ever attempted. My hands were so numb that I could not operate the door handle or start the engine immediately. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes running the heater and slowly warming my extremities before I trusted myself to drive safely on mountain roads that were now covered with ice from the storm. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I had suffered frostbite on 3 fingers of my left hand and both of my big toes. The damage to 2 of the fingers was severe enough to require amputation of the tips, a permanent reminder of how quickly winter conditions can become life-threatening, even for experienced and well-prepared campers. The gear I abandoned at the campsite was never recovered. When rescue personnel checked the area after the storm passed, they found my collapsed tent buried under 3 feet of snow and ice. The shelter that had seemed so robust and reliable had been completely overwhelmed by conditions that, while extreme, were not unprecedented for that region during winter. I learned that winter camping requires not just good gear and knowledge, but also the wisdom to recognize when conditions exceed your preparation, and the courage to retreat before a challenging situation becomes a survival emergency. The mountains do not care how much money you spent on equipment or how many books you have read about cold weather camping. Nature sets the rules, and those rules can change without warning. Respect those rules or pay a price that might be more than you are willing to accept. I still camp, but never again alone in winter conditions and never without multiple backup plans for shelter failure and emergency evacuation. The cold does not negotiate and it does not forgive mistakes. When winter shows its true power, your only choice is to get out of its way or become another cautionary tale for the next person who thinks they can conquer the elements through preparation alone. I have been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, specializing in capturing rare bird species in their natural habitats. Most photographers focus on the more accessible subjects, but I built my reputation by documenting species that few people ever see in the wild. This required spending weeks in remote locations, often camping alone in areas where human presence was minimal, and wildlife behavior remained undisturbed by civilization. The assignment that changed everything came from a nature magazine that wanted documentation of the northern spotted owl in old-growth forests of Oregon. The species had been declining for decades, and recent conservation efforts were showing some promise, but photographic evidence of their recovery was limited. The magazine offered a substantial fee for quality images of the owls in their nesting habitat during the critical breeding season. I chose a section of the Cascade Range that had been protected from logging for over 50 years. The forest was pristine, with Douglas fir trees over 300 feet tall, and an understory that had developed the complex structure that spotted owls require for successful nesting. Access required a 5-mile hike on an unmaintained trail, followed by another 2 miles of bushwhacking through dense undergrowth to reach the area where the owls had been reported. Setting up camp in such a remote location required careful planning. I carried enough supplies for 10 days, including a specialized telephoto lens system that weighed almost 20 pounds by itself. The campsite I chose was a small clearing next to a seasonal stream positioned to provide access to the 3 different areas where I hoped to find active owl nests. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I located 2 active nests and managed to photograph the adult owls during their dawn and dusk hunting periods. The photographs were exceptional, showing the birds in the kind of pristine habitat that most people assume no longer exists. I felt confident that I had already captured enough material to satisfy the magazine assignment. It was on the 4th morning that I noticed something was wrong with the forest. I woke up before dawn, as I always did, to prepare for the early morning photography session. But instead of the usual symphony of bird calls that typically greets the sunrise in old-growth forest, there was complete silence. Not just quiet, but absolute silence. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. In 12 years of wilderness photography, I had never experienced anything like it. Forests are never completely silent unless something has disturbed the normal balance of wildlife activity. My first thought was that a large predator might be in the area. Bears or mountain lions can cause other animals to go quiet, but even then the silence is usually temporary and localized. This silence was different. It felt oppressive, almost artificial. I packed my photography gear and hiked to the first owl nest location, hoping that normal forest sounds would resume as I moved through the area. They did not. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that I could not identify. When I reached the nesting site, I discovered that the owls were gone. Not just absent for hunting, but completely gone. The nest itself looked abandoned, with none of the fresh pellets or droppings that indicate active use. It was as if the birds had simply vanished overnight, leaving behind a perfectly intact but sterile nesting site. The second nesting location showed the same pattern. No birds, no signs of recent activity, and an eerie emptiness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I have spent enough time in wilderness areas to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I needed to leave this place immediately. But professional curiosity overrode my survival instincts. I had never documented a phenomenon like this, and the photographer in me wanted to understand what could cause an entire forest ecosystem to go silent simultaneously. I decided to spend one more day investigating before packing up and leaving. That decision almost cost me my life. As I was hiking back toward my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed movement in the canopy above me. At first, I thought it might be the missing owls finally returning to their territory. I stopped and raised my binoculars to get a better look at whatever was moving among the branches. What I saw through the binoculars made no sense. The trees were full of shapes that looked like animals, but not any animals I could identify. They were hanging from the branches in clusters, completely motionless like some kind of bizarre fruit. The shapes were roughly the size of small mammals, but their proportions were wrong, and they appeared to be suspended by something that was not visible through the binoculars. I switched to my telephoto camera lens to get a clearer view of what I was seeing. Through the high-powered lens, the shapes became more distinct, but also more disturbing. They were definitely animal remains, but they had been arranged in the trees in a systematic pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Small mammals, birds, even what looked like larger animals, all suspended from branches at roughly the same height throughout the forest canopy. The arrangement was too organized to be natural. Predators do not hang their prey in geometric patterns, and scavengers do not typically leave carcasses suspended in trees. This looked like the work of something that understood spatial relationships and had the ability to manipulate objects with precision and planning. I took dozens of photographs documenting what I was seeing while trying to understand what could create such a display. The images showed clearly that the suspended animals had been dead for different lengths of time. Some appeared fresh while others were in various stages of decomposition. This suggested that whatever was responsible had been active in this area for an extended period. As I was photographing the suspended remains, I realized that I was looking at the missing wildlife from the forest. The birds, small mammals, and insects that should have been creating the normal sounds of a healthy ecosystem were all here, hanging dead in the trees like some macabre art installation. The silence of the forest suddenly made perfect sense. There were no living animals left to make noise. Something had systematically killed everything in a large area and arranged the bodies in this grotesque display. And I was alone in the middle of it. I packed my gear and started hiking back toward my campsite as quickly as the terrain would allow. The forest felt different now that I understood what had happened to its normal inhabitants. Every shadow could be hiding whatever predator was responsible for the carnage in the trees. Every sound, and there were very few, made me stop and listen for signs of approaching danger. When I reached my campsite, I found evidence that whatever had killed the forest animals had also been investigating my presence. My tent had been moved slightly, and items from my camp kitchen had been rearranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched and repositioned. I broke camp immediately, despite the approaching darkness. Hiking out of the forest at night was dangerous, but staying in an area where an unknown predator was actively hunting seemed more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rough trail, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The hike out took 6 hours instead of the usual 3, partly because of the difficult night conditions and partly because I was moving as quietly as possible to avoid attracting attention. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I felt like I had escaped from something that I still could not fully understand. I developed the photographs when I returned to civilization, hoping that they would provide clues about what I had witnessed. The images clearly showed the arranged animal remains, but they also revealed details that I had not noticed while taking them. In several frames, there were shapes moving in the background, partially hidden by the tree trunks and branches. The shapes were large, much larger than any native wildlife in the area. They moved with a deliberate purpose that suggested intelligence, and they seemed to be aware of my presence even while I was photographing the suspended animals. In one particularly clear image, something that looked almost human was visible in the deep shadows between the trees, watching me from a distance. I never published those photographs, and I never wrote the article about the spotted owls for the magazine. The images were too disturbing, and the implications of what they showed were too frightening to share publicly. Instead, I submitted a report to the State Wildlife Agency, describing the area as temporarily unsuitable for research due to an unknown ecological disturbance. I have not returned to that forest, and I have not spoken publicly about what I witnessed there. But sometimes when I am working in other remote areas, I find myself looking up into the tree canopy, checking to make sure that nothing unnatural is hanging from the branches above me. The forest taught me that not all predators hunt on the ground, and not all dangers in the wilderness can be identified from field guides or survival manuals. Trust your instincts when the forest goes silent. There is always a reason, and sometimes that reason is something you do not want to encounter alone. After years of working in corporate marketing in downtown Chicago, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines, office politics, and the constant stress of city life. I had been dreaming of taking a solo retreat to reconnect with nature and clear my mind before making some major life decisions about my career and relationships. I chose Yellowstone National Park for my destination, specifically a lesser-known area called the Beckler region, known for its pristine wilderness, natural hot springs, and relatively few visitors compared to the main tourist areas of the park. I planned the trip as a 5-day solo camping and hiking adventure, carrying everything I needed in a backpack and relying on natural water sources for drinking water. I had researched the area extensively, studying topographic maps and identifying reliable streams and springs that would provide clean water throughout my planned route. The Beckler region is famous for its thermal features and pristine water quality, and park literature described several springs as having water so pure that no treatment was necessary. The first 2 days exceeded all my expectations. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling meadows, dense forests, and crystal-clear streams meandering through valleys that felt untouched by human activity. I encountered very few other hikers, which was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude was healing, allowing me to disconnect from the noise and pressure of my daily life and reconnect with the natural world. My campsite on the second night was positioned near a natural spring that emerged from a rocky hillside and formed a small pool before flowing into a larger creek. The water was incredibly clear, and the spring itself was surrounded by lush vegetation that indicated a reliable year-round water source. I had been filtering and treating water from streams during the first part of my trip, but this spring looked so pristine that I decided to drink directly from the source, following the advice in my guidebook that suggested many of the thermal springs in the area were safe for direct consumption. The water tasted clean and refreshing, with a slight mineral taste that I attributed to the natural thermal activity in the area. I filled my water bottles from the spring and used the water for cooking dinner and washing dishes. That evening, I felt more relaxed and content than I had in months, sitting by my small campfire and watching the stars emerge in a sky unobscured by city lights. I woke up during the third night feeling nauseous and dizzy. At first, I attributed the symptoms to the change in altitude and diet, thinking that my body was just adjusting to the physical demands of backpacking and camping. But as the night progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps that made it difficult to remain comfortable in any position. By morning, I was unable to keep food down and was experiencing frequent bouts of vomiting that left me weak and dehydrated. I tried to treat the symptoms by resting and sipping small amounts of water, but even tiny sips triggered more nausea and vomiting. I began to realize that I was dealing with something more serious than simple altitude sickness or dietary adjustment. My condition continued to deteriorate throughout the day. The stomach cramps became so severe that I could barely stand upright, and the vomiting became so frequent and violent that I was bringing up nothing but bile and stomach acid. I was losing fluids faster than I could replace them, and I began to recognize the early signs of serious dehydration, including dizziness, confusion, and difficulty concentrating. By the fourth day, I was in critical condition. I had not been able to keep solid food down for over 36 hours, and my attempts to stay hydrated were failing because even water triggered immediate vomiting. I was becoming dangerously weak, and I realized that I might be facing a medical emergency that could become life-threatening without proper treatment. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that explained my illness and filled me with horror about what I had been drinking. While exploring the area around the spring to see if I could find any obvious sources of contamination, I followed the flow of water upstream to its source in the rocky hillside. What I found there made me realize that the pristine spring I had been using as my primary water source was not as clean as it appeared. About 50 yards upstream from where the spring emerged, I found the partially decomposed carcass of a large elk that had apparently died and fallen into the water source several weeks or months earlier. The animal had been dead long enough that most of the soft tissue had rotted away, but the remaining bones and hide were still contaminating the water that fed the spring I had been drinking from. The sight of the decomposing elk explained everything. The bacteria and toxins from the rotting carcass had been carried downstream by the underground water flow, contaminating the spring that I had assumed was safe for direct consumption. I had been drinking water that was heavily contaminated with dangerous bacteria and possibly other toxic compounds from the decomposing animal. Understanding the source of my illness did not improve my situation. I was still severely dehydrated and unable to keep liquids down, and I was now at least a day's hike from the nearest ranger station or road access. My physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was beginning to experience symptoms that suggested serious complications from the bacterial infection and dehydration. I made the difficult decision to abandon my planned route and attempt to reach help as quickly as possible, even though hiking in my weakened condition was dangerous. I packed only the most essential items, leaving most of my camping gear behind to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through difficult terrain while battling constant nausea, dizziness, and weakness. Several times during the hike out, I had to stop and rest because I was too weak to continue. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, and I began to worry that I would collapse before reaching help. My thinking was becoming increasingly confused due to dehydration and the effects of the bacterial infection, and I found myself making poor decisions about route finding and rest stops. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I collapsed on the trail and could not get back up. I was too weak to continue hiking, and I realized that I might die in that spot if other hikers did not find me soon. I used the last of my strength to move to a visible location beside the trail and to set up my emergency signaling equipment, hoping that someone would pass by before my condition became critical. I was found by a group of day hikers about 3 hours later, unconscious and severely dehydrated. They immediately called for emergency medical assistance and provided basic first aid while waiting for park rangers and paramedics to arrive. The rescue team had to carry me out on a stretcher because I was too weak to walk, and I was rushed to the nearest hospital for emergency treatment. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I was suffering from severe bacterial gastroenteritis and dehydration that had progressed to the point of kidney dysfunction and electrolyte imbalances that could have been fatal within hours. I spent 5 days in the hospital receiving intravenous antibiotics and fluids, and it took several weeks for my digestive system to fully recover from the effects of the contaminated water. The most disturbing aspect of the experience was learning from park officials that this was not an isolated incident. Several other hikers had reported similar illnesses after drinking from water sources in the same general area, and park biologists had identified multiple contaminated springs and streams caused by animal carcasses and other sources of bacterial contamination. The lesson I learned is that water sources that appear pristine and clean can be deadly, and that natural does not always mean safe. Even in protected wilderness areas like national parks, water sources can be contaminated by factors that are not visible to casual observation. Animal deaths, mineral deposits, and bacterial blooms can all create dangerous conditions in water that looks perfectly safe to drink. I recovered physically from the experience, though I still have some digestive issues that my doctor attributes to the severe bacterial infection I suffered. More significantly, the experience changed my entire approach to wilderness camping and my relationship with natural environments. I now carry multiple water treatment systems and never assume that any water source is safe without proper purification, regardless of how clean it appears. The wilderness is not malicious, but it is indifferent to human needs and assumptions. Nature follows its own rules, and those rules can be deadly for people who assume that natural environments will be safe and benevolent. The spring that nearly killed me was doing exactly what springs do, carrying water from its source to its destination without regard for what that source might contain. Trust your preparation more than your assumptions, and remember that the most dangerous threats in the wilderness are often the ones that look perfectly safe. Clean water is essential for survival, but clean-looking water can kill you just as effectively as any obvious hazard. Always treat water from natural sources, no matter how pristine the environment appears, because you cannot see the bacteria that might be living in that crystal-clear stream. The mountains and forests are beautiful and healing, but they are also completely indifferent to your survival. Respect that indifference by taking every precaution, even when it seems unnecessary. Your life might depend on that paranoia. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another collection of disturbing accounts that have been carefully documented and preserved from the darkest corners of Oregon. In this episode, we will journey through 6 harrowing tales of human encounters with forces that defy explanation. each story drawn from real testimonies of individuals who survived experiences that forever changed their understanding of what lurks in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest. From Forest Service rangers to coastal patrol officers, from urban explorers to farm workers, these witnesses have come forward to share their most terrifying encounters with phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from detailed accounts provided by those who lived through these events. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the essential truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily collections of true horror content that will challenge everything you thought you knew about our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next buried truth. Let us know in the comments below which Oregon location you would never visit alone after hearing these stories. After 15 years working for the Oregon Forest Service, I thought I had seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong, and what happened last October in the Deschutes National Forest ended my career. My name is Joshua, and I used to patrol the backcountry areas where most people never venture. It was my job to monitor trail conditions, check for illegal camping, and ensure hikers stayed safe in some of the most remote wilderness Oregon has to offer. I loved that job more than anything in my life, which makes what I am about to tell you that much harder to accept. The incident happened during what should have been a routine patrol of the Three Sisters Wilderness area. I had been assigned to check a section of trail that had been closed to the public for 3 months due to reported landslide damage. The area was about 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only on foot through dense pine and fir forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I had hiked this particular section dozens of times over the years, and I knew every landmark, every stream crossing, and every potential hazard along the way. That morning started like any other. I loaded my pack with the usual gear, emergency supplies, radio equipment, and my service weapon. The weather forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a long day hike into the wilderness. I signed out at the ranger station at 6:30 in the morning and began the trek to the closed trail section. The first few hours passed without incident as I made my way along familiar paths, documenting trail conditions and taking photographs of areas that would need maintenance attention. The trouble started around 11 in the morning when I reached the section that had reportedly suffered landslide damage. According to the incident report filed 3 months earlier, a massive rock slide had completely blocked the trail, making it impassable for hikers. But when I arrived at the coordinates listed in the report, I found the trail completely clear. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris, no damaged trees, nothing that would suggest any kind of geological event had occurred in the area. The trail looked exactly as it had during my last patrol 6 months earlier. I spent nearly an hour examining the area, taking photographs and measurements to document what I was seeing. According to my GPS unit, I was definitely in the right location. The coordinates matched perfectly with those listed in the incident report, but there was absolutely no sign of the landslide that had supposedly closed this section of trail. I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings, but I could not get through. The radio crackled with static, which was unusual given that I had tested the equipment that morning and confirmed it was working properly. I decided to continue along the trail to see if perhaps the landslide had occurred further ahead than originally reported. The path wound through increasingly dense forest with towering Douglas firs creating a thick canopy overhead. The undergrowth was heavy with ferns and moss, and the air carried that distinctive smell of decomposing pine needles and damp earth that you only find deep in old-growth forests. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, until I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. In 15 years of working in these woods, I had never experienced such complete and unnatural silence. Every instinct I had developed during my career was telling me that something was very wrong. I stood motionless for several minutes, listening carefully for any sound that might explain the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. That was when I first heard it, a low humming sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. It was barely audible at first, more of a vibration that I felt in my chest than an actual sound. But as I stood there listening, it gradually grew louder and more distinct. The humming had an almost mechanical quality to it, like the sound of distant machinery or electrical equipment. But there were no power lines in this area, no buildings, no roads, nothing that could produce such a sound. I pulled out my GPS unit to confirm my location and verify that I had not somehow wandered off course. The display showed that I was still following the designated trail, miles from any human development. I decided to investigate the source of the humming sound, moving carefully along the trail with all my senses on high alert. The sound grew gradually louder as I advanced, and I began to notice other unusual signs. The trees along the trail appeared to be dying, their needles brown and brittle despite the fact that it was still early fall. The undergrowth was sparse and sickly looking, as if something had drained all the life from the forest floor. After walking for another 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing that I had never seen before, despite having hiked this trail numerous times over the years. The clearing was perfectly circular, about 50 feet in diameter and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard like concrete with strange geometric patterns etched into the surface. The humming sound was much louder here, and I could feel it resonating through the soles of my boots. At the center of the clearing stood what I can only describe as some kind of structure, though it defied any conventional architectural description. It appeared to be made of a dark metallic material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure was roughly cylindrical, about 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, with no visible seams, joints, or openings. The surface was covered with the same geometric patterns that were etched into the ground, and the entire thing seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. I approached the structure cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around and leave immediately. But my training and professional curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I needed to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that could be analyzed and explained by people with more expertise than I possessed. I pulled out my camera and began taking photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the structure itself and the strange patterns carved into the clearing floor. As I moved around the structure taking pictures, I noticed that my compass was spinning wildly, unable to settle on any consistent direction. My GPS unit had stopped working entirely, displaying only error messages when I tried to determine my location. Even more disturbing, my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at exactly 11:47, though I was certain it had been working properly when I checked it earlier. The humming sound began to change, becoming more complex and varied, almost like some kind of alien language or communication system. I could feel the vibrations growing stronger, penetrating deep into my body and making my bones ache. The air around the structure began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Though the temperature felt normal, that was when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in my peripheral vision. But as I focused my attention on them, the shadows became more distinct, more solid. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were featureless and dark, like voids in the shape of human heads. There were 3 of them that I could see clearly, though I had the sense that more were present just beyond the tree line. They moved with purpose, circling the clearing in a pattern that seemed to mirror the geometric designs carved into the ground. They paid no attention to me at first, as if I were invisible or irrelevant to whatever they were doing. I continued taking photographs, though my hands were shaking so badly that I was not sure any of the images would be usable. Part of me wanted to run to get as far away from that clearing as possible. But another part, the professional part that had served me well during my career, insisted that I needed to document everything I was witnessing. This was beyond anything in my training or experience, but it was real, and it was happening in a forest that was under my protection. One of the shadow figures suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. Even though it had no visible eyes or facial features, I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. The humming sound changed again, becoming sharper and more urgent, almost threatening in its tone. The other figures stopped their circling and also turned toward me. I felt a wave of something, not heat or cold, but some other form of energy that made every nerve in my body scream in alarm. My camera stopped working, the display going dark despite a full battery. My radio, which had been producing only static, went completely dead. Even the digital display on my GPS unit flickered and went blank. I knew that I had to leave immediately. Every survival instinct I possessed was telling me that I was in mortal danger. I backed slowly toward the tree line, never taking my eyes off the shadow figures. They did not follow me, but I could feel their attention tracking my every movement. The humming sound grew louder and more aggressive, as if warning me never to return. Once I reached the safety of the forest, I turned and ran. I ran harder and faster than I had ever run in my life, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs in my desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing. I did not stop running until I reached my vehicle, and even then I could still feel the phantom vibrations of that alien humming in my bones. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. How could I possibly report what I had witnessed? Who would believe such an impossible story? But I had to try. I had a professional and moral obligation to document the incident and ensure that other people did not stumble into whatever was lurking in that clearing. When I arrived at the station, I immediately went to my supervisor and requested a private meeting. I told him everything, describing the clearing, the structure, and the shadow figures in as much detail as I could remember. He listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as my story progressed. When I finished my account, he asked to see the photographs I had taken. I handed over my camera, but when we reviewed the images, they showed nothing but normal forest scenes. The clearing was not visible in any of the pictures, nor was the strange structure or the shadow figures. According to the camera, I had spent the day hiking through perfectly ordinary woodland. My supervisor suggested that I might be suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration, both of which could cause hallucinations and disorientation. He recommended that I take a few days off to rest and recover, and then we would discuss the incident further. But I knew what I had seen was real despite the lack of photographic evidence. Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that maybe my supervisor was right. Maybe I had experienced some kind of medical episode that caused me to hallucinate the entire incident. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The memory of that clearing was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent to be dismissed as a hallucination. I requested permission to return to the area with a partner, but my supervisor denied the request. He cited safety concerns and suggested that I focus on less remote assignments until I had fully recovered from whatever had affected me during the patrol. but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. The final straw came 3 weeks later when I tried to access the incident report that had originally sent me to investigate the landslide. According to the filing system, no such report existed. There was no record of any landslide in that area, no closure order for the trail, and no assignment for me to investigate. According to the official records, I had never been sent to that section of the Deschutes National Forest. When I confronted my supervisor about the missing paperwork, he became defensive and suggested that I might be confusing details from different assignments. He implied that my mental state was deteriorating and that perhaps it was time for me to consider early retirement. The message was clear: stop pursuing this matter or face the consequences. I realized that whatever was happening in that clearing was being covered up at levels far above my pay grade. Someone or something did not want that area investigated or documented. My choice was simple: stay quiet and keep my job, or continue asking questions and face termination. I chose to resign. I could not continue working for an organization that would hide something so significant from the public. People had a right to know about the dangers lurking in our national forests, even if those dangers defied conventional explanation. That was 6 months ago. I have not returned to the Deschutes National Forest since then, and I have no intention of ever going back. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I swear I can still hear that alien humming sound calling to me from the depths of the Oregon wilderness. I know most people will not believe my story, just as my former supervisor did not believe it. But I also know that what I experienced in that clearing was real, regardless of what the official records might say. There are things in our forests that we do not understand, things that someone in authority has decided we are better off not knowing about. All I can do now is warn others to be careful when venturing into remote wilderness areas. Stay on marked trails, travel with partners, and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. The forest may look peaceful and welcoming, but there are places where the normal rules of reality do not apply. And those places are far more dangerous than any wild animal you might encounter. If you ever find yourself in a clearing where no birds sing and no insects buzz, where strange structures rise from geometric patterns carved into lifeless earth, do not investigate, do not take photographs, do not try to understand what you are seeing. Just run and never look back. I have been doing Oregon Trail reenactments for 8 years, always trying to make the experience as authentic as possible. But during our 2024 journey near Baker City, we discovered that some parts of history should never be relived. My name is Olivia, and what I am about to tell you is why I will never participate in another historical reenactment as long as I live. For those who do not know what Oregon Trail reenactments involve, we are a group of history enthusiasts who spend weeks each summer recreating the journey that pioneers made across the American West in the 1800s. We use authentic equipment, dress in period clothing, and follow the same routes that thousands of families traveled over 150 years ago. The goal is to gain a deeper understanding of the hardships and challenges faced by those brave souls who helped build this country. Our group consisted of 12 adults and 6 children ranging in age from 8 to 62. We had been planning this particular reenactment for 2 years, working with historians and local authorities to map out an authentic route through eastern Oregon that would take us along some of the lesser-known segments of the original Oregon Trail. The journey was scheduled to last 3 weeks, covering approximately 180 miles of challenging terrain. I had been elected as the wagon master for this expedition, which meant I was responsible for coordinating our daily movements, ensuring everyone stayed safe, and maintaining the historical accuracy of our experience. I took this role very seriously, spending months researching the specific challenges faced by pioneer families in this region during the 1840s and 1850s. Our preparation was extensive. We had authentic covered wagons pulled by oxen, period-appropriate clothing and tools, and historically accurate food supplies including hardtack, dried beans, and salted meat. We carried no modern conveniences except for emergency communication equipment and basic medical supplies, both of which were kept hidden from sight to maintain the illusion of authenticity. The first week of our journey went exactly as planned. The weather was favorable, our oxen were strong and healthy, and the group was in high spirits. We followed wagon ruts that were still visible after more than a century, camping each night in locations that had been used by actual pioneer families during their westward migration. The children in our group were especially excited, treating the entire experience like the ultimate educational adventure. But everything changed during our second week, when we reached a section of the trail near Baker City that none of us had ever traveled before. According to our historical maps, this area had been the site of several tragic incidents during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. Families had been forced to abandon wagons and possessions when the terrain became too difficult to navigate. Some had died from disease, others from accidents, and a few had simply disappeared without explanation. The landscape in this region was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain, steep hills, and very little water. The original pioneers had struggled mightily to cross this section, and we were beginning to understand why. Our oxen were having difficulty pulling the wagons over the rough ground, and we were forced to stop frequently to rest both the animals and ourselves. It was during one of these rest stops that we first noticed something unusual. While examining the ground around our campsite, one of our group members discovered what appeared to be remnants of an old wagon wheel, partially buried in the dirt and rocks. This was not uncommon along the Oregon Trail, as pioneers were often forced to abandon equipment that became too damaged or burdensome to continue carrying. But as we examined the wheel more closely, we realized it was in remarkably good condition for something that should have been over 150 years old. The wood showed signs of age and weathering, but it had not rotted or disintegrated the way we would have expected. More disturbing, there were dark stains on the wood that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Our group historian, a retired professor named Margaret, suggested that we might have discovered an artifact from one of the documented tragedies that had occurred in this area. She pulled out her research materials and confirmed that at least 3 separate wagon trains had reported serious incidents at this location, including accidents, illness, and attacks by hostile parties. That night, as we sat around our campfire eating our simple meal of beans and hardtack, Margaret shared some of the historical accounts she had uncovered during her research. The stories were darker than any of us had expected, involving not just the typical hardships of frontier life, but also violence, betrayal, and mysterious disappearances that had never been properly explained. One account from 1847 described a family of 7 who had stopped to rest in this exact area after their wagon broke down. When a search party found them 3 days later, the parents and oldest children were missing, and the 2 youngest children were found hiding in the wagon, too traumatized to speak. The children eventually told authorities that strange people had come in the night, people who looked like pioneers but acted wrong, moving and talking in ways that frightened them. Another story from 1852 involved a wagon train of 23 families who camped in this region for 2 nights while making repairs to their equipment. On the second night, several members of the group reported hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, voices that sounded like family members who were supposed to be sleeping in their wagons. When they investigated, they found their actual family members safe in their beds with no explanation for the voices they had heard. The most disturbing account came from 1856, when a group of 15 pioneers reported encountering what they described as a phantom wagon train. According to their testimony, they had seen another group of travelers moving parallel to their route, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When they attempted to make contact with these other pioneers hoping to join forces for mutual protection, the Phantom group would disappear entirely, only to reappear in a different location hours later. As Margaret shared these historical accounts, I noticed that several members of our group were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The children especially seemed frightened by the stories, and I began to worry that our pursuit of historical authenticity might be having a negative impact on what was supposed to be an educational and enjoyable experience. But it was too late to change course. We were committed to following the historical route, and we were already 2 weeks into our journey with only 1 week remaining. We had invested too much time, money, and effort to abandon the expedition based on old stories and legends that probably had perfectly rational explanations. That night, I lay in my bedroll listening to the sounds of the wilderness around us. The wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of coyotes, and the occasional snort or shifting movement of our oxen as they grazed nearby. But mixed in with these natural sounds, I began to hear something else. Voices, very faint and distant, that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond our campsite. At first, I assumed it was other members of our group talking quietly around the dying embers of our campfire. But when I raised my head to look, I could see that everyone in our camp was asleep. The voices were coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by our fire. I listened carefully, trying to determine what the voices were saying and where exactly they were coming from. They seemed to be having a conversation, multiple people discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. But I could not make out the specific words, and the sounds seemed to move around our campsite, coming first from one direction and then from another. I considered waking the others, but I did not want to cause unnecessary alarm over what might simply be travelers camped somewhere nearby. Instead, I lay quietly and continued to listen, hoping the voices would either stop or become clear enough for me to understand what was being said. After nearly an hour of listening to the mysterious conversation, I finally heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices clearly called out the name of Margaret, our group historian, not shouting her name as if trying to get her attention, but discussing her in the same hushed tone that had characterized the entire conversation. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. Someone was out there in the darkness talking about one of our group members by name. This was no coincidence, and it was certainly not a group of innocent travelers who happened to be camping nearby. I quietly made my way over to where Margaret was sleeping and gently shook her awake. When she opened her eyes, I put my finger to my lips and pointed toward the darkness where the voices were coming from. She sat up slowly, listening carefully, and after a few minutes she heard them too. We woke the other adults in our group one by one, being careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Soon we had 8 adults sitting quietly around the remains of our campfire, all listening to the mysterious voices that continued to drift through the darkness around us. The conversation seemed to be focused on our group specifically, discussing our movements, our equipment, and individual members by name. They knew details about our journey that no outsider should have known, including our planned route for the following day and the specific supplies we were carrying in our wagons. One of the men in our group, a retired military officer named Robert, suggested that we might be dealing with modern-day thieves who had been monitoring our expedition and were planning to rob us of our authentic historical equipment and supplies. Some of our wagons, oxen, and period artifacts were worth considerable money, and we were carrying everything in isolated wilderness areas where criminal activity would be difficult to detect or investigate. But as we continued to listen to the voices, it became clear that this was not a simple robbery scheme. The people talking about us were discussing our journey in ways that suggested they knew far more about the historical Oregon Trail than any ordinary criminals would know. They referenced specific events from the 1800s, mentioned families and individuals who had traveled this route over 150 years ago, and spoke about our reenactment as if it were somehow connected to those long-ago tragedies. Margaret grabbed her research materials and began looking through her historical accounts, comparing what the voices were saying to the documented incidents she had uncovered. The correlation was undeniable. The voices were referencing the same families, the same tragedies, and the same mysterious disappearances that had been reported in this area during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. As dawn began to break, the voices gradually faded away, leaving us exhausted and deeply unsettled. We had spent the entire night listening to people discuss our expedition in detail, but we had never seen who was talking or determined where they were located. Despite searching the area around our campsite, we found no evidence that anyone else had been nearby during the night. We faced a difficult decision. We could continue with our planned route, hoping that the previous night had been an isolated incident, or we could abandon our carefully planned expedition and head for the nearest town. The rational part of me wanted to continue, to maintain the historical authenticity of our journey and complete what we had started. But the protective part of me was deeply concerned about the safety of the children in our group. The decision was made for us later that morning when we discovered that one of our wagons had been damaged during the night. The canvas top had been slashed in multiple places and several of our essential supplies had been stolen, including most of our remaining food and all of our medical supplies. Whoever had been talking about us in the darkness had also taken action against us. Robert conducted a thorough investigation of the crime scene, using his military training to look for clues about who might have been responsible for the theft and vandalism. What he found was more disturbing than the crime itself. The footprints around our damaged wagon were not from modern hiking boots or work shoes, but from what appeared to be authentic period footwear. The kind of leather boots and shoes that pioneers would have worn during the 1800s. More unsettling, the method used to slash our wagon canvas was not consistent with a modern knife or blade, but rather with the kind of rough, improvised cutting tools that would have been available to travelers on the original Oregon Trail. Someone was not just stealing from us, but doing so in a way that was historically authentic to the period we were trying to recreate. We had no choice but to abandon our expedition. With our food supplies stolen and our wagon damaged, we could not safely continue our journey, especially with children in our group. We loaded our remaining supplies into the undamaged wagons and began the difficult trek back toward the nearest town where we could get help and contact authorities about the theft. The return journey was tense and frightening. We moved as quickly as possible while constantly watching for signs that we were being followed or observed. Several times during that first day, members of our group reported seeing figures in the distance, people dressed in period clothing who seemed to be shadowing our movements but always staying just far enough away to avoid clear identification. On our final night before reaching town, we experienced the most terrifying incident of the entire expedition. As we set up camp in what we hoped would be a safe location near a well-traveled road, we began to hear the voices again. But this time, they were not discussing our movements from a distance. They were calling to us directly, trying to convince members of our group to leave the safety of our campsite and come into the darkness. The voices claimed to be other reenactors who had become separated from their own group and needed our help. They knew the names of several people in our expedition and referenced specific details about our journey that made their claims seem plausible. But Robert and I recognized the voices from the night before, and we knew that this was some kind of trap or trick designed to lure us away from our group. The most chilling moment came when one of the voices called out to Margaret specifically, claiming to be her research partner from the university, and insisting that he had discovered evidence of an important historical artifact nearby. The voice knew details about Margaret's academic work that no stranger should have known. and for a moment even she seemed tempted to investigate. We managed to keep everyone together until morning, but it required constant vigilance and repeated reminders that nothing good could come from venturing into the darkness to meet mysterious strangers who claimed to need our help. The children were especially frightened by the voices calling to them, and several of the adults admitted later that they had felt an almost irresistible urge to respond to the calls. When we finally reached town the next day, we immediately contacted local law enforcement to report the theft and harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The sheriff listened to our account with a mixture of skepticism and concern, clearly having difficulty believing that we had been systematically stalked and robbed by people dressed as 1800s pioneers. But when we mentioned the specific location where the incidents had occurred, his expression changed dramatically. He explained that our group was not the first to report strange encounters in that particular area. Over the years, several other historical reenactment groups, hiking parties, and even some local residents had described similar experiences involving mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know far more about visitors than they should. The sheriff suggested that we might be dealing with a group of individuals who had become obsessed with Oregon Trail history to the point where they were living out some kind of elaborate fantasy in the wilderness. These people might be using their extensive historical knowledge to intimidate and rob visitors while maintaining the illusion that they were somehow connected to the original pioneer experience. But he also mentioned a darker possibility that had been discussed among local law enforcement. There had been several unexplained disappearances in the region over the years involving people who had last been seen hiking or camping in areas associated with Oregon Trail history. While there was no concrete evidence connecting these disappearances to the mysterious figures that visitors kept reporting, the correlation was troubling enough to warrant serious concern. We never recovered our stolen supplies or received any explanation for the harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The case remained open but inactive, with local authorities occasionally following up on similar reports but never making any arrests or gathering definitive evidence about who was responsible for the ongoing incidents. I disbanded our reenactment group after that experience, and I have never participated in another Oregon Trail expedition. Several other members of our group reported having nightmares for months afterward, dreams involving the voices calling to them from the darkness and mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know intimate details about their personal lives. Margaret continued her historical research for a while, but she eventually abandoned her Oregon Trail project as well. She told me later that she could no longer read accounts of pioneer tragedies without hearing those voices from the wilderness, and that the entire subject had become too psychologically disturbing for her to continue studying. The children in our group were perhaps affected most severely by the experience. Several of them developed anxiety about camping or spending time outdoors, and their parents reported that they would wake up in the middle of the night claiming to hear voices calling their names from outside their bedrooms. I still believe that historical reenactments can be valuable educational experiences when conducted safely and appropriately. But I also know that there are some places and some periods of history that should be left undisturbed. The Oregon Trail represents one of the most challenging and tragic chapters in American pioneer history, involving thousands of deaths, countless hardships, and mysteries that have never been solved. Perhaps some of those mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the voices we heard in the darkness were echoes of tragedies that occurred more than 150 years ago, still playing out in places where the boundary between past and present has become dangerously thin. Or perhaps we encountered something far more concrete and threatening, a group of people who have become so obsessed with recreating the past that they have lost touch with the present. Either way, I learned that there are limits to how authentic a historical experience should be, and that some parts of history are too dangerous to relive. The Oregon Trail claimed thousands of lives during the years of westward migration, and it may still be claiming lives today. I urge anyone interested in Oregon Trail history to study it from the safety of libraries and museums rather than venturing into the wilderness areas where those original tragedies occurred. Some experiences are meant to remain in the past, and some voices are meant to remain silent. The lessons of history are important, but they should never come at the cost of modern lives and safety. The trail west was difficult enough for the original pioneers who had no choice but to travel it. Those of us who do have a choice should choose wisely. Working maintenance at Crater Lake during the off-season means months of complete isolation. It is just you, the snow, and that impossibly deep water. But in February of 2023, I realized I was not as alone as I thought. My name is Christopher, and for 12 years I have been part of the park maintenance crew that keeps Crater Lake National Park running when the tourists are gone and the roads are buried under 15 feet of snow. Most people do not realize what it takes to maintain a place like Crater Lake through the winter months. We are talking about one of the most remote locations in Oregon, accessible only by snowcat or skis for nearly 6 months of the year. The park officially closes to vehicle traffic in November, and we do not see regular visitors again until late May or June. During those winter months, only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers, rangers, and emergency personnel remain on site. I have always loved the isolation that comes with winter work at Crater Lake. There is something peaceful about being surrounded by pristine wilderness, with nothing but the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake surface. The work is hard, physical labor in brutal conditions, but it has always been worth it for the solitude and the connection to one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Our crew of 4 was responsible for maintaining the visitor center, the lodge facilities, and the critical infrastructure that keeps the park operational during the winter closure. We lived in staff quarters at the rim, isolated from the outside world for weeks at a time. Communication with the outside was limited to radio contact with park headquarters and emergency services, and even that was often unreliable due to weather conditions and the mountainous terrain. The incident began during one of the worst blizzards I have ever experienced at the lake. We had been dealing with a series of winter storms that had dumped more than 8 feet of fresh snow in less than a week. The wind was howling constantly, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. We were essentially trapped in our quarters, waiting for the weather to break so we could assess the damage to park facilities. It was during the 3rd night of the storm that I first heard the sounds. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the wind rattling the windows, when I became aware of something else mixed in with the storm noise. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking in urgent, hushed tones. At first, I assumed it was one of my co-workers using a radio or maybe watching something on their tablet. But when I got up to investigate, I found that everyone else was sound asleep. I returned to my bunk, telling myself that I had been hearing things. The isolation and constant storm noise could play tricks on your mind, and I had experienced auditory hallucinations during previous winter assignments. But the voices continued, becoming clearer and more distinct as I lay there listening. They seemed to be coming from outside the building, somewhere in the storm. The next morning, when the wind finally died down enough for us to venture outside, I mentioned what I had heard to my supervisor. He listened with the kind of patient attention that suggested he had dealt with similar reports before. He explained that the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation of winter work could cause people to hear things that were not there, and that it was nothing to be concerned about unless it interfered with my work performance. But I knew what I had heard, and it had not sounded like a hallucination. The voices had been too clear, too consistent, too purposeful. They had been discussing something specific, though I could not make out the exact words. More disturbing, they had seemed to be moving around the building as if a group of people were conducting some kind of patrol or search in the middle of a blizzard. Over the next few days, as we worked to clear snow from the visitor center and assess storm damage to park facilities, I found myself constantly listening for the voices. I did not hear them during the day, but every night they returned. Always the same pattern, starting sometime after midnight and continuing until just before dawn. Always the same urgent, hushed tones, as if people were discussing something they did not want to be overheard. The other members of our crew did not report hearing anything unusual, which made me question my own sanity. I began to wonder if the isolation was affecting me more than I had realized. I had worked winter assignments at Crater Lake for over a decade, but this was the most severe weather I had ever experienced, and we had been cut off from outside contact for longer than usual due to the repeated storms. But my doubts about what I was hearing ended abruptly during my fourth night at the lake. I was lying awake listening to the voices outside when I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of the voices clearly said my name, not shouting it, not calling out to me, but discussing me in the same hushed tone they used for everything else. "Christopher is in the East Wing," the voice said, as clearly as if someone had been standing next to my bed. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone was outside our building in the middle of a blizzard talking about me specifically. I got out of bed, pulled on my winter gear, and grabbed a powerful flashlight from my equipment kit. I was going to find out who was out there and what they wanted. The moment I stepped outside, I realized how foolish I was being. The storm was still raging, though not as violently as the previous nights. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. No rational person would be outside in these conditions unless they were in immediate danger, but I could still hear the voices coming from somewhere near the visitor center. I followed the sound, moving carefully through knee-deep snow and using my flashlight to avoid obstacles buried under the drifts. The voices seemed to be coming from the area around the main visitor center building, but as I got closer, they seemed to move away, always staying just at the edge of my hearing range. I spent nearly an hour searching through the storm, following the voices as they led me in a rough circle around the RIM facilities. My flashlight beam revealed nothing but wind-blown snow and the dark shapes of buildings and trees. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been moving through the area. But the voices continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Eventually, the cold forced me to give up the search and return to the staff quarters. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I knew I was risking frostbite by staying outside any longer. But as I reached the door to our building, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears. The voices were now coming from behind me, discussing my search in the same hushed tones they had used earlier. "He knows we are here," one voice said. "What should we do about that?" asked another. The conversation continued, but I could not make out the rest as I fumbled with the door lock and rushed inside to the warmth and safety of the building. The next morning, I told my supervisor everything that had happened during my late-night search. I expected him to be concerned about my mental state, or at least worried that I was suffering from severe cabin fever. Instead, he listened with a grim expression that suggested he knew more than he had been willing to share previously. When I finished my account, he was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape around the lake. Finally, he turned back to me and said that I was not the first maintenance worker to report hearing voices during winter assignments at Crater Lake. Over the years, several other employees had described similar experiences, always during the most severe weather, always during the deepest isolation of the winter months. He explained that the Park Service had never been able to find any explanation for the reports. There were no records of unauthorized people in the park during winter closures, No evidence of camps or shelters that might house individuals living off the grid. The voices seemed to appear only during the worst weather, when conditions would make survival nearly impossible for anyone caught outside without proper shelter. Some employees had theorized that the voices were related to the tragic history of Crater Lake, where numerous people had died over the years in accidents, suicides, and disappearances. The extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions might somehow amplify psychic impressions left by those who had perished at the lake. Others suggested that the voices might be connected to the Native American legends about Crater Lake being a gateway to the spirit world. But my supervisor also shared a more disturbing possibility that had been discussed among long-term park employees. There had been reports, never officially confirmed, of people living in the wilderness areas around Crater Lake during winter months. Individuals who had chosen to disconnect entirely from civilized society, surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. These hypothetical hermits would have intimate knowledge of the park layout, the location of maintenance facilities, and the schedules followed by winter crews. They might observe park employees from a distance, gathering information for reasons no one could understand. The harsh winter conditions would make detection nearly impossible, as their tracks would be quickly covered by snow and wind. The conversation with my supervisor did nothing to ease my fears about what I had been hearing. If anything, it made the situation worse by confirming that other people had experienced similar encounters. I was not losing my mind, but I was also not dealing with anything that had a rational explanation. Over the remaining weeks of my winter assignment, I continued to hear the voices on a regular basis. They seemed to be monitoring our activities, discussing our work schedules and personal habits with an attention to detail that was deeply unsettling. I began to feel like I was living under constant surveillance, watched by unseen observers who knew everything about my daily routine. The voices followed me when I worked alone in remote areas of the park, always staying just out of sight but close enough to make their presence known. They seemed to know when I was carrying my radio and when I was beyond the range of communication with other park employees. During those times, their conversations became more detailed and more threatening. On one particularly disturbing occasion, I heard them discussing the layout of the staff quarters, including specific details about which rooms were occupied and which were empty. They knew where I slept, where I kept my personal belongings, and what my work schedule would be for the following week. The level of surveillance implied by their knowledge was terrifying. I began taking precautions that would have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances. I varied my work routes and schedules as much as possible. I never worked alone in remote areas without first checking in with other crew members. I kept emergency supplies with me at all times, including extra food, water, and cold weather gear. But the voices seemed to adapt to my precautions, always staying one step ahead of my attempts to avoid them. They began appearing in areas where I had never heard them before, including inside park buildings where they should not have been able to operate without being detected by other employees. The final incident occurred during my last week at the lake. I was conducting a routine inspection of the visitor center heating system when I heard voices coming from somewhere inside the building. They were discussing a plan to approach me directly, to make contact rather than simply observing from a distance. I immediately radioed my supervisor and requested backup, but by the time another crew member arrived, the voices had stopped. A thorough search of the building revealed no signs of intruders, no evidence that anyone had been inside who should not have been there. My supervisor arranged for me to leave the park 2 days early, officially due to a family emergency, but actually because he was concerned about my psychological state. I was relieved to go, and I have never returned to Crater Lake for a winter assignment. I still do not know what I was hearing during those weeks of isolation at the lake. The official explanation is that extreme stress and sensory deprivation caused me to experience auditory hallucinations. But I know the difference between imagination and reality, and what I heard was real. There is something in the wilderness around Crater Lake that watches and waits during the winter months. Something that knows the park better than the people who work there. Something that monitors human activity with an intelligence and purpose that defies explanation. Whether it is living people who have chosen to exist outside civilized society or something else entirely, I cannot say. All I know is that Crater Lake is not as empty during the winter as it appears to be. There are observers in those snow-covered forests, watchers who know your every move and discuss your activities in hushed, urgent voices that carry on the winter wind. I have transferred to a different park, one that does not require winter isolation assignments. I sleep better now knowing that I am not being watched by unseen eyes or discussed by voices that should not exist. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I think I can still hear them calling my name. Most people do not know that Portland sits on top of hundreds of miles of forgotten tunnels and abandoned spaces. I made it my mission to explore every single one of them, until I found something down there that was exploring me back. My name is Madison, and for 3 years I have been documenting the hidden underground network that runs beneath the city. What started as a hobby became an obsession, and eventually became a nightmare that I am still trying to forget. I discovered urban exploration during my second year at Portland State University. A friend mentioned the Shanghai tunnels, those infamous passages that supposedly ran beneath Old Town. Most people dismissed them as tourist folklore, but I was intrigued by the possibility that an entire hidden world existed right under our feet. I started researching the history, mapping the known entrances, and planning my first descent into the underground. The initial explorations were incredible. I found myself in forgotten basements, abandoned utility tunnels, and steam passages that had been sealed off for decades. Each discovery felt like uncovering a piece of Portland history that had been deliberately hidden from the world above. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating maps of the underground network that grew more complex with each expedition. I developed techniques for accessing the tunnels safely. I learned to pick locks, to read architectural plans, and to identify which manholes led to active infrastructure versus abandoned passages. I invested in professional equipment including headlamps, climbing gear, and waterproof cameras. I established rules for myself, never exploring alone, always leaving detailed plans with friends and maintaining emergency communication protocols. But as my explorations became more ambitious, I began to bend those safety rules. The most interesting discoveries always seemed to require solo missions into areas that other urban explorers avoided. I told myself that my experience made me capable of handling situations that would be dangerous for beginners. I was wrong about that, and my arrogance nearly cost me everything. The incident happened in early March during an exploration of a tunnel system beneath the industrial district on the east side. I had been mapping this particular network for weeks, working methodically through connected passages that seemed to extend much farther than any official records indicated. The tunnels were old, probably dating back to the early 1900s, with brick walls and arched ceilings that showed the craftsmanship of a different era. I was about 2 hours into the exploration, working my way through a section that I had never accessed before, when I noticed something unusual. The tunnels in this area showed signs of recent activity. There were fresh footprints in the dust, improvised lighting fixtures strung along the walls, and crude furniture made from salvaged materials. Someone was living down there, and they had been for quite some time. My first instinct was to turn back immediately. Encountering homeless camps in urban exploration was not uncommon, but it required extreme caution. These were people who had been pushed to the margins of society, and they often viewed explorers as threats to their safety and security. I knew the smart thing to do was to retreat and find a different route for my mapping project. But curiosity got the better of me. The living space was more elaborate than anything I had seen before. There were multiple rooms connected by carefully maintained passages with evidence of electrical work and plumbing modifications that must have required considerable skill and planning. This was not a temporary shelter, but a permanent underground community that had somehow remained hidden from city authorities. I continued deeper into the inhabited section, moving as quietly as possible and documenting everything with my camera. The construction was impressive, with reinforced walls, drainage systems, and ventilation shafts that had been carefully integrated into the existing tunnel structure. Whoever lived here had spent years developing this space, and they clearly intended to stay. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to determine their exact location or distance. I immediately turned off my headlamp and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. The voices were male, at least 2 different speakers, and they were discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. I could not make out the specific words, but the tone was definitely threatening. They were angry about something, and that anger seemed to be directed at an intruder in their space. It took me several seconds to realize that they were talking about me. They knew I was there, and they were planning to do something about it. I started moving back toward the way I had come, but the voices seemed to be getting closer. The tunnel acoustics made it impossible to determine which direction they were approaching from, and I realized that I might have already been cut off from my planned escape route. I was in their territory, surrounded by people who viewed my presence as a direct threat to their safety and security. I found a side passage that I had not explored and decided to hide there until the voices moved away. But as I crouched in the darkness, I began to hear other sounds that made my situation much worse. There were more voices coming from different directions, and they seemed to be coordinating some kind of search pattern. They were not just looking for me, they were hunting me. The realization that I was being systematically tracked through the tunnel system triggered a panic response that I had never experienced before. My heart was racing. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely operate my equipment. I was trapped underground with an unknown number of people who clearly meant me harm, and I had no way to call for help. I forced myself to stay calm and think strategically about my situation. I had been mapping these tunnels for weeks, so I knew the general layout better than I would have in a completely unfamiliar location. There were multiple exit points, and if I could avoid the search parties, I might be able to reach one of them before being caught. But I would have to move quickly and quietly, and I could not afford to make any mistakes. I started moving through the side passages, using my knowledge of the tunnel layout to stay ahead of the voices. But the underground community clearly knew their territory much better than I did. Every time I thought I had found a clear path to an exit, I would hear voices blocking that route. They were forcing me deeper into the tunnel system, away from the exits I knew about and into areas that I had never explored. The hunt continued for what felt like hours. I moved through passage after passage, always listening for voices, always looking for a way out that was not being watched. My equipment was running low on battery power, and I knew that once my lights failed, I would be completely helpless in the darkness. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, and I began to make increasingly desperate decisions. I found myself in a section of tunnel that was partially flooded, with several inches of standing water covering the floor. The water was ice cold and had a smell that suggested it was not just groundwater, but sewage or industrial runoff that had been accumulating for years. I waded through it anyway, hoping that the searchers would be reluctant to follow me into such unpleasant conditions. The flooded section led to a junction with several branching passages, and for the first time in hours, I could not hear any voices nearby. I chose the passage that seemed to angle upward, hoping it would lead me back towards street level and a possible exit. But after following it for several hundred yards, I found myself at a dead end with no way forward. I was forced to backtrack through the flooded section, and when I reached the junction again, I could hear voices approaching from multiple directions. They had found my trail through the water, and they were closing in on my position. I had nowhere left to run, and my battery power was nearly exhausted. In desperation, I found a drainage pipe that was just large enough for me to crawl through. It was a tight fit, and the pipe was filled with debris and standing water, but it was my only option. I turned off my headlamp to conserve what little battery power remained and began crawling through complete darkness, guided only by the feel of the pipe walls around me. The pipe seemed to go on forever. My knees and elbows were scraped raw from crawling over rough concrete and metal debris. The water soaked through my clothes, and the cold began to affect my coordination and judgment. Several times I became stuck and had to force myself through openings that seemed too small for my body. But eventually I saw light ahead of me. The pipe opened into a storm drain that led to a culvert under a busy street. I could hear traffic above me, and I knew that I was finally close to escape. I crawled the last few yards and emerged into daylight, covered in filth and shaking from cold and exhaustion. I found myself in an industrial area on the east side of the river, several miles from where I had entered the tunnel system. I was disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive and free. I walked to the nearest business and called a friend to pick me up, making up a story about a bicycle accident to explain my condition. I never returned to urban exploration after that day. The experience taught me that there are spaces beneath the city that belong to people who have been forgotten by the world above, and those people will defend their territory with whatever means they have available. I had been lucky to escape, and I knew that luck would not protect me a second time. Sometimes I still think about the underground community I discovered. I wonder who they were, how they ended up living in those tunnels, and whether they are still there. But I will never try to find out. There are some secrets that are meant to remain hidden, and some places where outsiders are not welcome. The tunnels beneath Portland are vast and complex, full of history and mystery. But they are also home to people who have nowhere else to go, and those people deserve to be left in peace. Urban exploration taught me to respect the spaces I visited, and sometimes that respect means knowing when to stay away. In 22 years of Oregon State Police work, I have handled everything from domestic disputes to homicides. But what I encountered on Highway 101 near Bandon defied every protocol I had ever learned. My name is Tyler, and after 2 decades of law enforcement, I thought I had seen every type of criminal behavior and emergency situation that could occur on Oregon's highways. I was wrong about that, and what happened during my patrol shift last November still keeps me awake at night. Highway 101 runs along the entire Oregon coast, connecting small towns and tourist destinations through some of the most beautiful but also most isolated stretches of road in the Pacific Northwest. During the off-season, particularly in late fall and winter, traffic on the highway drops to almost nothing. You can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, especially on the remote sections between Bandon and Gold Beach, where the road winds through dense forest and rocky coastline. I had been working the Coastal Patrol for 8 years, covering the stretch of Highway 101 from Coos Bay to the California border. It was generally quiet work, mostly involving traffic stops for speeding tourists and the occasional accident during storms when visibility dropped to near zero. The most serious incidents I typically dealt with were drunk drivers heading home from the coastal casinos and domestic disputes at some of the more isolated beach houses. The incident began during what should have been a routine patrol shift on a foggy November evening. I was driving southbound near Bandon around 10:30 in the evening when I received a radio call about a stranded motorist approximately 15 miles ahead of my position. The caller had used a cell phone to contact dispatch, reporting that their vehicle had broken down and that they were parked on the shoulder of the highway, waiting for assistance. This type of call was common along Highway 101, especially during the rainy season when older vehicles frequently experienced mechanical problems. My standard procedure was to respond to the location, assess the situation, and either provide assistance or coordinate with a tow truck company to get the stranded vehicle off the highway. As I drove toward the reported location, I noticed that the fog was becoming increasingly dense, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some areas. This was also typical for the Oregon coast during fall and winter, when warm ocean air collided with cooler land temperatures to create thick marine layers that could persist for hours. When I reached the coordinates provided by dispatch, I found no sign of a stranded vehicle or motorist. I parked my patrol car on the shoulder and activated my emergency lights, then began searching the immediate area for any evidence that someone had been there recently. I checked both sides of the highway, looked for tire tracks in the soft shoulder, and used my flashlight to examine the ditch areas where a vehicle might have gone off the road. After 20 minutes of searching, I radioed dispatch to report that I had found no trace of the reported stranded motorist. The dispatcher confirmed the coordinates and suggested that the caller might have been confused about their exact location, which was also common in areas where cell phone coverage was spotty and GPS signals could be unreliable. I was preparing to expand my search to adjacent areas when I noticed headlights approaching from the north. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was moving unusually slowly, barely maintaining highway speed despite the fact that this particular section of road was straight and relatively safe even in foggy conditions. The vehicle passed my position without stopping, which struck me as odd since most drivers would at least slow down or pull over when they saw a patrol car with emergency lights activated. As the tail lights disappeared into the fog ahead of me, I decided to follow and conduct a routine traffic stop to see if the driver was experiencing problems or needed assistance. I caught up with the vehicle after about 2 miles, but when I activated my overhead lights to signal the driver to pull over, the car did not respond. It continued traveling at the same slow speed, maintaining its position in the right lane without acknowledging my presence. I radioed in my position and license plate number, but dispatch reported that the plate did not match any vehicle in their database. Over the next several miles, I followed the vehicle while repeatedly activating my siren and using my public address system to instruct the driver to pull over. The car showed no response to any of my attempts to make contact, continuing to travel at exactly 35 miles per hour, despite the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour. As we continued south, I began to notice other unusual aspects of the situation. The vehicle itself appeared to be an older model sedan, possibly from the 1980s or early 1990s, but it was in remarkably good condition despite its apparent age. The taillights were bright and clear, the body showed no signs of rust or damage, and the exhaust was clean without any visible smoke or emissions. More disturbing, I could not see any occupants inside the vehicle despite being directly behind it, with my headlights providing illumination through the rear window. The car appeared to be driving itself, maintaining perfect lane control and consistent speed without any visible human intervention. After following the vehicle for nearly 10 miles, I made the decision to attempt a pit maneuver to force it to stop. This was an extreme measure, but I was growing increasingly concerned about the safety implications of a vehicle that was not responding to law enforcement signals and appeared to be operating without a driver. I positioned my patrol car alongside the rear quarter panel of the suspect vehicle and began to execute the maneuver. But at the moment of contact, something impossible happened. My patrol car passed directly through the other vehicle as if it were not there at all. I felt no impact, heard no sound of collision, and experienced no change in my vehicle's momentum or direction. I immediately pulled over to the side of the highway, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just occurred. I sat in my patrol car for several minutes, checking my equipment and trying to determine if I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency or equipment malfunction that might explain what I had witnessed. I radioed dispatch to request backup and medical assistance, explaining that I was experiencing a situation that I could not adequately describe or understand. The dispatcher asked if I was injured or in immediate danger, and I honestly did not know how to answer. I was physically unharmed, but I was deeply shaken by an encounter that violated every law of physics and reality that I understood. While I waited for backup to arrive, I conducted a thorough inspection of my patrol car, looking for any sign of damage that might indicate I had actually collided with another vehicle. I found no evidence of impact, no scratches or dents, and no debris that might have come from another car. According to all physical evidence, I had not made contact with anything during my attempted PIT maneuver. When backup arrived 30 minutes later, I explained the situation to Sergeant Rodriguez, a 25-year veteran of the state police who had worked the Coastal Patrol longer than anyone in our unit. He listened to my account with a serious expression, asking detailed questions about the vehicle's appearance, behavior, and my attempts to make contact. When I finished my report, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes before telling me something that changed my understanding of the entire incident. He explained that I was not the first officer to report encounters with phantom vehicles on Highway 101. Particularly in the area between Bandon and Gold Beach where my incident had occurred. Over the years, several other officers had described similar experiences involving vehicles that appeared normal at first glance but exhibited impossible behavior when subjected to closer examination. These vehicles never responded to traffic stops, never pulled over despite extended pursuit, and sometimes seemed to vanish entirely when officers attempted to make physical contact. Rodriguez told me that the department had an unofficial policy of not discussing these incidents publicly, partly to avoid ridicule and partly because there was no rational explanation for what officers were witnessing. The reports were filed and documented, but no further investigation was conducted because there was no evidence of criminal activity and no apparent threat to public safety. He also shared some historical context that made the situation even more unsettling. The stretch of Highway 101 where these incidents occurred had been the site of numerous fatal accidents over the decades, including several cases where drivers had simply disappeared along with their vehicles. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of the missing drivers or cars despite extensive efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. Some of the missing persons cases dated back to the 1960s and 1970s when Highway 101 was even more isolated and dangerous than it is today. Families had reported that their loved ones had failed to arrive at their destinations after traveling this route, but no evidence was ever found to indicate what had happened to them. Rodriguez suggested that what I had encountered might be connected to these historical disappearances, though he admitted that he had no explanation for how such a connection might be possible. He recommended that I file a complete report of the incident, but advised me not to discuss it with other officers or civilians who might not understand the unique challenges of coastal patrol work. I followed his advice and filed a detailed report, but I also began conducting my own research into the history of Highway 101 and the missing persons cases that Rodriguez had mentioned. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original incident. Over the past 50 years, at least 17 people had disappeared while traveling the section of Highway 101 between Bandon and Gold Beach. Their vehicles had never been found, despite extensive searches of the coastline, forest areas, and remote roads in the region. In several cases, witnesses had reported seeing the missing person's vehicle on the highway after they were supposed to have reached their destination, but these sightings were generally dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. Reading through these historical accounts, I began to wonder if what I had encountered was not a phantom vehicle, but rather evidence of some ongoing phenomenon that had been claiming travelers on this stretch of highway for decades. Perhaps the people who disappeared were still somehow present on the road, continuing their journeys in a form that was visible but not quite real. I requested a transfer to a different patrol area 6 months after the incident. I told my supervisors that I wanted new challenges and opportunities for professional development. But the truth was that I could no longer patrol Highway 101 without thinking about what I had encountered that foggy November night. I still drive the coastal highway occasionally when visiting family or taking vacation trips, but I am always aware of the other vehicles around me in ways I never was before. Sometimes, late at night when the fog is thick and visibility is poor, I think I see familiar taillights in my mirrors, always maintaining that same impossibly consistent speed and distance. I know that some of my fellow officers think I experienced a hallucination or some kind of stress-related episode. But I also know what I saw, and I know that Highway 101 holds secrets that go far beyond anything covered in police training or protocol manuals. The Oregon coast is beautiful, but it is also dangerous, and some of that danger cannot be addressed by conventional law enforcement methods. All I can do is continue serving and protecting to the best of my ability, while remaining aware that there are forces at work on these remote highways that I will never fully understand. I have been part of Mount Hood's search and rescue team for 6 years, and we have saved dozens of lives in those mountains. But our last mission in the wilderness area near Government Camp was not about saving anyone. It was about surviving what we found up there. My name is Brandon, and what happened during our February 2024 rescue operation changed my understanding of what exists in the high country around Oregon's most dangerous peak. Mount Hood is one of the most climbed mountains in North America, attracting thousands of hikers and climbers every year. It is also one of the most deadly, with an average of 3 to 4 fatalities annually, and dozens of rescue operations. Our team, Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue, responds to calls from county sheriffs when people go missing or get injured in the backcountry areas around the mountain. The mission began with a standard distress call on February 15th. A group of 3 experienced backcountry skiers had failed to return from a planned 2-day trip into the Government Camp wilderness area. Their emergency locator beacon had activated around 4:30 p.m., indicating they were in serious trouble somewhere in the vast expanse of forest and alpine terrain on the mountain's southwest slopes. Weather conditions were challenging but not impossible. Fresh snow had fallen during the previous 48 hours and temperatures were well below freezing. But visibility was good and winds were relatively calm. We assembled a team of 8 volunteers, including myself as team leader, and began organizing our search strategy based on the beacon's last known coordinates. The missing skiers were all local residents with extensive backcountry experience. Tom Bradley, 34, was a certified ski instructor who had been exploring Mount Hood's wilderness areas for over 10 years. Sarah Chen, 29, was an emergency room nurse who regularly participated in avalanche rescue training. Mark Stevens, 41, was a professional mountain guide who had summited Mount Hood more than 20 times. These were not inexperienced tourists who had gotten in over their heads. They were skilled outdoors enthusiasts who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. The fact that their emergency beacon had been activated suggested they were dealing with something serious, possibly a severe injury or avalanche burial that prevented them from self-rescuing. We began our search at first light on February 16th, using snowmobiles to access the general area where the beacon signal had originated. The terrain in that section of Mount Hood is extremely challenging, with steep slopes, deep ravines, and dense forests that can hide hazards like tree wells and unstable snow conditions. The initial phase of our search followed standard protocols. We divided into 2 teams and began working systematic search patterns, using avalanche probes and rescue dogs to check areas where the missing skiers might be buried under snow. We also used GPS units to precisely navigate to the coordinates provided by their emergency beacon. After 4 hours of intensive searching, we found their camp. The 3 skiers had established a well-organized base camp in a sheltered area near a grove of large pine trees. Their tents were properly set up, their equipment was neatly arranged, and there were no signs of avalanche activity or other natural disasters that might explain their disappearance. But the camp had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Food was still cooking on their camp stove, personal belongings were scattered around the site, and their sleeping bags were thrown aside as if they had been sleeping when something forced them to leave immediately. Most disturbing, we found clear evidence that they had left the camp during the night, in sub-zero temperatures and dangerous conditions that no experienced backcountry traveler would willingly venture into. We followed their tracks leading away from the camp and immediately realized that something was very wrong. The tracks showed that all 3 skiers had been moving together in a tight group, but they were not following any logical route towards safety. Instead, they appeared to be heading deeper into the wilderness, toward terrain that was more dangerous and further from any possible rescue or shelter. The tracks also showed signs that the skiers had been moving unusually fast, almost running on their skis despite poor visibility and hazardous conditions. There were several places where 1 or more of them had fallen, but they had gotten up immediately and continued moving in the same direction, as if they were fleeing from something behind them. After following the trail for nearly 2 miles, we came to an area where the tracks suddenly stopped. Not gradually, as if the skiers had removed their skis to continue on foot, but abruptly in the middle of an open slope where there was no logical reason for them to change direction or method of travel. The snow around the end of the ski tracks was disturbed in ways that we could not explain. There were marks and impressions that did not match any equipment the skiers had been carrying, and the snow itself seemed to have been compressed by something much heavier than 3 people on skis. We spent the rest of that day expanding our search in all directions from where the tracks ended, but we found no further sign of the missing skiers. We used avalanche probes to check for possible burial sites, thermal imaging equipment to look for body heat signatures, and trained search dogs to try to pick up human scent traces. As evening approached, we established our own camp near the location where the ski tracks had ended. Standard protocol for multi-day search operations required us to maintain a base camp that could serve as a command post and staging area for continued searching. We set up our tents, prepared hot meals, and organized watch schedules for the night. It was during the first watch, around 11:30 p.m., that we encountered the phenomena that transformed our rescue mission into something entirely different. I was on duty with Jake Morrison, a veteran rescue volunteer with over 15 years of mountain experience, when we first heard the sounds. They started as distant voices, barely audible over the wind through the pine trees. At first, we assumed they were coming from other members of our team, perhaps talking quietly in their tents. But when we checked, we found that everyone else was asleep and the voices were coming from somewhere outside our camp. The voices sounded like people calling for help, which would have been consistent with finding the missing skiers. But there was something wrong with the calls. They seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and they had an echoing quality that did not match the acoustics of the area where we were camped. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and emergency medical supplies and began moving toward the source of the voices, following standard procedures for responding to calls for help in the wilderness. But as we got closer to where the sounds seemed to be coming from, they would move, always staying just at the edge of our hearing range. We spent nearly an hour following the voices through the forest, but we never found anyone who might have been calling for help. The sounds led us in a rough circle around our camp, always seeming to come from just ahead of us, but never getting closer or more distinct. When we returned to camp, we discovered that our tents had been moved. Not dramatically, and not in a way that suggested deliberate vandalism, but they were definitely in different positions than where we had set them up earlier in the evening. Our equipment had also been rearranged, with items moved from their original locations and placed in neat piles that none of our team members remembered creating. The other members of our search team had been awakened by the disturbance, and they had their own reports of unusual activity. Several people described feeling as if they were being watched while trying to sleep, and 2 team members reported seeing figures moving between the trees just outside the circle of light cast by our camp lanterns. We conducted a thorough perimeter check looking for any evidence of who might have been in our camp while Jake and I were following the voices. We found footprints in the snow around our tents, but they were not from any of our team members. The prints appeared to be from bare feet, which made no sense given the sub-zero temperatures and deep snow conditions. At that point, we made the decision to terminate the search operation and evacuate our team from the mountain. As experienced rescue volunteers, we were trained to recognize when conditions had become too dangerous to continue, and the unexplained activity around our camp clearly represented a threat to our safety. But our evacuation was complicated by equipment failures that had not been present earlier in the mission. Our GPS units began providing inconsistent readings, making it difficult to navigate back to our vehicles. Our radio communications with base camp became intermittent and filled with static. Even our emergency backup equipment seemed to be affected by whatever was causing the other malfunctions. The return trip to our staging area took nearly twice as long as expected, as we were forced to rely on compass navigation and visual landmarks to find our way through terrain that several of our team members had traveled many times before. Throughout the descent, we continued to hear the voices calling from various locations around us, but we made no attempt to investigate or respond. When we finally reached our vehicles and re-established communication with county emergency services, we learned that the search for the 3 missing skiers had been called off. Their bodies had been found early that morning by a different search team working in an area more than 5 miles from where we had been searching. The circumstances of their deaths raised questions that were never adequately answered. All 3 bodies were found together in a location that made no logical sense given the evidence we had found at their camp and along their ski trail. They appeared to have died from exposure, but they were discovered without any of their survival equipment, including the heavy winter clothing they had been wearing when they left their camp. Most disturbing, the location where their bodies were found was accessible only by traveling through terrain that would have been extremely difficult and dangerous to navigate at night, especially without proper equipment. There was no explanation for how or why they had made such a journey, or what had happened to their skis, packs, and other gear. The official incident report concluded that the 3 skiers had become disoriented during the night and had made poor decisions that led to their deaths from exposure. But those of us who had been involved in the search knew that the explanation did not account for the evidence we had observed or the unusual phenomena we had encountered. I submitted a detailed report describing everything our team had experienced during the search operation, but I was advised by county officials that such details would not be helpful to the families of the deceased and might create unnecessary public concern about safety in the Mount Hood Wilderness area. I have not participated in any search and rescue operations on Mount Hood since that mission. I transferred to a team that works primarily in lower elevation areas, telling my supervisors that I wanted to focus on urban rescue operations. But the truth is that I can no longer feel comfortable in the high country around Mount Hood, knowing that there are things up there that do not have rational explanations. The mountain continues to attract thousands of climbers and hikers every year in search, and rescue teams continue to respond when people get into trouble in the wilderness areas. But I know that some of the dangers they face cannot be addressed by training, equipment, or experience, and that Mount Hood holds secrets that go far beyond the well-documented risks of avalanches, weather, and difficult terrain. Sometimes the people who go missing in those mountains encounter something other than natural hazards, and sometimes the rescue teams sent to find them discover that they are not alone in the wilderness after all.